Good evening, and welcome back to Bedtime and Historian. Let me begin tonight with a gentle question, one that people living nearly 2,000 years ago never thought to ask themselves. How dangerous can a mountain really be, when it has always been part of the view? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you'd like, tell me where you're listening from tonight, and what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the 1st century of the Roman Empire, the land around the Bay of Naples was considered one of the most pleasant corners of the Mediterranean world. The soil was dark, rich, and famously productive. Vineyards climbed gentle slopes, olive groves filled the low hills, villas dotted the coastline, their owners drawn by warm breezes and calm seas. In the middle of this landscape rose a broad, quiet mountain. It was not sharp or dramatic in outline. Its sides were green, its peak often hazy. No one alive had ever seen it erupt. To the people who lived beneath it, the mountain was not a threat. It was a landmark, a source of fertile soil and little more. The Roman towns of Pompeii and Herculaneum grew comfortably in its shadow. Pompeii sat slightly inland, busy and noisy, shaped by trade, politics, and the constant movement of people. Herculaneum lay closer to the sea, smaller and more refined, favoured by wealthier residents who preferred calm streets and elegant homes. Both towns were part of the same world, Roman in law, language, and customs, yet deeply local in character. They had forums, temples, baths, taverns, bakeries, workshops, and crowded streets worn smooth by generations of feet. Life here followed rhythms that felt stable and predictable. The sun rose over the bay. Markets opened. Slaves swept thresholds and carried water. Merchants arranged their goods. Children walked to lessons or helped in family businesses. In the afternoons, people bathed, socialized, argued about politics, and watched performances. Evenings brought meals, oil lamps, and quiet conversations behind courtyard walls. It was a world where the future seemed like a continuation of the present. Yet the mountain was not as harmless as it appeared. Long before Romans built their towns, it had shaped the land through fire and ash. The rich soil that made Campania famous came from ancient eruptions, though no one remembered them. Earthquakes had shaken the region before, sometimes badly, but earthquakes were familiar across Italy. They were treated as inconveniences or divine warnings, not as signs of something much larger beneath the ground. In the year 62 AD, a powerful earthquake damaged Pompeii and surrounding towns. Buildings cracked, walls collapsed, temples and houses required years of repair. But the disaster did not drive people away. Instead, it created work. Reconstruction brought money and opportunity. New decorations replaced old ones. Entire neighbourhoods were remodeled. By the late 70s AD, Pompeii was still rebuilding, but it was very much alive. Herculaneum, less damaged, continued almost uninterrupted. If anything, the quake had reinforced the belief that the land was resilient and that life always returned to normal. Roman understanding of nature was practical rather than scientific in the modern sense. They observed patterns, recorded unusual events, and respected the gods, but they did not think in terms of hidden geological systems. Mountains were mountains. Earthquakes were acts of divine displeasure or movements of air trapped underground, depending on which philosopher one preferred. Volcanoes, as a category, were poorly understood. Only a few places in the Roman world showed obvious volcanic activity, and even those were not studied systematically. The mountain near Pompeii did not smoke or rumble. It did not glow at night. Sheep grazed on its slopes. Farmers cut wood from its forests. Paths crossed its lower reaches. From a distance, it looked like part of the ordinary background of life. People built their homes without fear, invested their savings, raised their children, and planned their futures as if the landscape itself were permanent. This sense of stability is important to understand. The tragedy that would later define Pompeii and Herculaneum did not come to people who believed they were living in danger. It came to people who felt secure. They trusted their environment because it had always supported them. Their confidence was not foolish, it was based on lived experience. In the summer of 79 AD, nothing about daily life suggested that this confidence was misplaced. The empire was ruled by Emperor Titus, who had only recently come to power. Rome itself had endured fires, political tension, and rebuilding, but these events felt far away in Campania. Local concerns mattered more. Harvests, property repairs, family alliances, business contracts. The towns were busy preparing for autumn, a season of trade and travel. Pompeii in particular was full of motion. Its streets were narrow and crowded, lined with shops where owners lived above their workspaces. Political slogans were painted on walls, advertising candidates for local office. Public fountains ran continuously, fed by aqueducts that carried water from distant hills. Bread ovens burned daily, supplying neighbourhoods with fresh loaves stamped by their bakers' marks. Everything about the town suggested continuity. Herculaneum, though smaller, shared the same confidence. Its houses were taller, its streets cleaner. Many residents were members of the Roman elite or wealthy freedmen. Some owned luxurious seaside villas with private baths and shaded terraces. Fishing boats came and went from the shore. The sea, like the mountain, appeared calm and dependable. What no one could see was the slow movement happening deep underground. Pressure was building far below the surface, in chambers that had been sealed for centuries. The earth above did not crack or open. There was no dramatic warning, no clear signal that something unprecedented was about to happen. Even small tremors, if noticed at all, were easy to dismiss. This is what makes the story of Pompeii and Herculaneum so striking. It is not a tale of people ignoring obvious danger. It is a story of ordinary life continuing right up to the edge of catastrophe, shaped by habits, assumptions, and trust in the familiar. The Romans of Campania did not live recklessly. They lived reasonably, according to everything they knew. As the final days approached, people slept, worked, and planned without anxiety. They repaired walls damaged years earlier. They decorated dining rooms with fresh paintings. They stored food for the coming months. Some prepared to travel, others welcomed visitors. Nothing about these actions suggests panic or fear. Instead, they show a society fully engaged in the present. The mountain watched silently over all of this. Its slopes remained green. Its outline did not change. It did not announce what it was about to do. From this calm setting, the events of late summer 79 AD would unfold, not as a sudden explosion of chaos, but as a sequence of moments that slowly broke the assumptions people lived by. What happened next would test how individuals responded to uncertainty, how communities tried to adapt, and how fragile even the most settled world could be. The story moves forward from here, not with alarm, but with quiet persistence, following the lives of towns that did not yet know they were living through their final ordinary hours. The region surrounding the Bay of Naples was known in the Roman world as Campania, a name that carried with it strong associations of abundance and comfort. Roman writers often described it as a place where nature seemed unusually generous. The land produced grain, wine, fruits, and olives in quantities that supported both local needs and export. The sea provided fish and easy transport. The climate was mild enough that winters were short and summers, though warm, were usually softened by coastal breezes. For many Romans, Campania represented a kind of ideal balance between work and leisure. Pompeii and Herculaneum were shaped by this setting in different ways. Pompeii, located a short distance from the coast, had grown into a bustling town, with a population likely numbering in the tens of thousands. It sat at a crossroads of regional trade routes, connecting inland farms with maritime commerce. Goods moved through its gates constantly. Agricultural produce, wine amphorae, pottery, textiles, and luxury items destined for wealthy households. Its streets reflected this activity. Carts rumbled over stone paving, porters carried loads balanced on their shoulders, animals were led through traffic alongside pedestrians. The town was organised around its forum, an open public space that served as the political, religious and economic heart of the community. Here stood temples dedicated to major Roman gods, administrative buildings where local officials conducted business, and markets where food and goods were sold. Public notices were posted on walls. Announcements of games, elections, and legal matters were painted in bold lettering. This constant flow of information reinforced the sense that Pompeii was firmly connected to the wider Roman system. Herculaneum, by contrast, felt more contained. Smaller and more orderly, it did not serve as a major commercial hub. Instead, it functioned largely as a residential town, favoured by wealthier inhabitants who preferred its quieter atmosphere. Its proximity to the sea allowed for easy access to fishing and maritime travel, but it lacked the sprawling markets and crowded streets of Pompeii. The social life of Herculaneum unfolded more behind closed doors, within private homes designed for comfort and display. Both towns were deeply Roman, yet each expressed Roman culture in its own way. Social hierarchy was clearly visible. At the top were local elites, often members of long-established families or individuals who had gained wealth through trade or imperial service. Below them were freedmen, former slaves who had earned or been granted their freedom and who often became successful entrepreneurs. At the base of society were enslaved people, whose labour sustained households, workshops, and farms. Daily life depended on this hierarchy functioning smoothly. In Pompeii, many shops were run by freedmen who lived above their businesses. Bakers operated large ovens that supplied entire neighbourhoods. Fullers processed cloth using methods that modern observers would find unpleasant but effective. Wine merchants blended and flavoured their products to meet local tastes. These trades were not hidden from view. They took place openly along the streets, blending domestic and commercial life. Public amenities played a crucial role in maintaining social cohesion. Bath complexes were among the most important shared spaces. They provided not only hygiene but also relaxation, conversation, and networking. Men and women typically bathed separately or at different times, but the baths were central to community life for all classes. Entry fees were low enough that even poorer residents could attend, at least occasionally. Inside, social boundaries softened, though they never fully disappeared. Religion also structured daily experience. Temples and household shrines reminded people of their obligations to the gods. Rituals were woven into ordinary routines. Offerings made before meals, prayers offered at crossroads, festivals marking seasonal changes. These practices reinforced a sense of order in the universe. Even disasters, when they occurred, were interpreted within this religious framework as events that had meaning, even if that meaning was not always clear. The political life of Pompeii in particular was lively. Local elections were competitive, and candidates sought support through public promises and personal connections. Walls throughout the town were covered with endorsements painted by supporters. These messages reveal concerns that still feel familiar: maintenance of public buildings, fair administration, and generosity in sponsoring games. Civic pride mattered. Townspeople identified strongly with their community and invested energy in its reputation. Despite this outward stability, Campania was not free from tension. Earthquakes had left visible scars. Some buildings remained partially repaired years after the major shock of 62 AD. Cracks in walls were patched, but not always fully concealed. In some cases, entire neighbourhoods showed signs of long-term disruption. Yet these reminders of instability became part of the landscape. People adapted to them rather than fleeing. The Roman approach to risk was shaped by experience and practicality. Life across the empire involved uncertainties, disease, fire, political change, and natural disasters. Communities responded by rebuilding and moving forward. The idea of abandoning fertile land because of potential danger would have seemed unreasonable to most residents of Campania. The benefits of living there were immediate and tangible. As the years passed after the earthquake, confidence returned fully. Investment resumed. Decorative programs inside houses became more elaborate. New businesses opened. Public buildings were restored or improved. This period of recovery reinforced the belief that whatever nature disrupted could be repaired. The past was not seen as a warning of something worse, but as proof that society could endure. The relationship between people and their environment was therefore based on trust. The mountain loomed in the background, but it was not central to daily thought. It did not demand attention. Instead, attention was directed toward human concerns: family, work, status, and pleasure. The landscape was a stage on which life unfolded, not an active participant in it. This mindset would shape how people responded when subtle changes began to occur. The habits formed during decades of relative calm encouraged patience and interpretation rather than immediate alarm. When the first unusual signs appeared, they were filtered through a worldview that assumed continuity. The idea that entire towns could vanish within days was outside lived experience. By the end of the summer of 79 AD, Campania was functioning much as it always had. Fields were cultivated, ships moved along the coast, markets remained busy, repairs continued. The region's reputation as a place of comfort and prosperity was intact. What lay beneath this surface of normality was invisible and unknowable to those living above it. The pressure building deep below did not announce itself in ways that made sense within Roman categories of understanding. The people of Pompeii and Herculaneum lived within a system that had worked for generations, and there was no clear reason to expect it to fail. Pompeii, at street level. Pompeii was a town best understood by walking through it slowly. From above, its grid of streets looked orderly, but at ground level it felt crowded, noisy, and constantly in motion. Stone paving blocks were worn smooth by carts and sandals. Deep grooves cut into the roads marked generations of wagon wheels following the same paths. Raised stepping stones allowed pedestrians to cross when rainwater or waste flowed through the streets, reminding everyone that urban life was practical before it was elegant. Most buildings served more than one purpose. A typical house opened directly onto the street, its entrance wide enough for customers to enter during the day. Behind the threshold, the space might function as a shop, a workshop, or a bar. Only further inside did private rooms appear, arranged around an open courtyard where light and air could circulate. Upper floors, often made of lighter materials, held sleeping quarters or storage rooms. In many cases, families lived directly above or behind their businesses, blurring any clear line between work and home. The streets themselves were lined with activity. Bakers began work early, their ovens already hot before sunrise. The smell of bread drifted outward, mixing with the sharper odours of dye works and tanneries. Wine shops opened their counters toward the street, offering cheap drinks to passers-by. Some sold warm food prepared in large ceramic jars built into masonry counters. These establishments served those who lacked kitchens of their own, which included many residents of small apartments. Public fountains stood at intersections, fed by lead pipes that carried water from aqueducts outside the town. These fountains were gathering points. Slaves filled containers for their households. Travellers stopped to drink. Conversations formed briefly and dissolved just as quickly. Water flowed constantly, a visible sign of Roman engineering and civic investment. It was easy to take such infrastructure for granted. Political life was also visible everywhere. Walls acted as notice boards. Painted slogans endorsed candidates for local office, often listing the names of supporters. Some messages were neat and professional, others hurried or uneven. Together, they created a layered record of civic engagement. Elections mattered in Pompeii. Local magistrates controlled public spending, games, and legal decisions. Even those without the right to vote were affected by the outcomes, and often participated indirectly by promoting favoured candidates. Religion occupied both public and private spaces. Temples dominated prominent areas near the Forum, dedicated to major gods of the Roman pantheon. Smaller shrines stood at street corners or inside workshops. In homes, household gods were honoured at small altars decorated with painted figures and offerings of food or incense. These practices were routine rather than dramatic. They reinforced a sense of order and continuity, linking daily actions to a larger cosmic structure. Entertainment offered another outlet for communal life. Pompeii had an amphitheatre large enough to host gladiatorial games attended by thousands. These events were loud, crowded, and emotionally charged, standing in contrast to the more measured pace of everyday routines. The amphitheatre also carried reminders of conflict. A violent riot between Pompeii and a neighbouring town decades earlier had led to a temporary ban on games, showing that even leisure could provoke serious consequences. Social distinctions were present everywhere, but rarely subtle. Large houses with decorated facades signalled wealth and status. Their interiors featured painted walls, mosaic floors, and carefully arranged gardens. These homes hosted dinners where guests reclined on couches and servants moved quietly in the background. At the same time, many residents lived in cramped quarters, sharing walls with neighbours and relying on public spaces for much of their daily life. The city held all of this together without pretending that everyone lived the same way. Slavery underpinned much of this urban economy. Enslaved people worked in households, shops, and public projects. They cooked meals, cleaned floors, carried goods, and assisted artisans. Some were highly skilled, managing businesses or educating children. Others performed exhausting manual labour. Their presence was constant but often unremarked upon, treated as a normal feature of society rather than a moral problem to be debated. Pompeii was also a place of constant repair and change. The earthquake years earlier had left lasting marks. Some buildings had been fully restored, with new decorative styles reflecting current tastes. Others remained in partial ruin, their damaged walls propped up or repurposed. Construction materials lay stacked along streets. Scaffolding rose against facades. The city was not frozen in a single moment of perfection. It was a work in progress. Despite these visible disruptions, confidence remained strong. People invested money and effort into improving their properties. They commissioned new wall paintings depicting mythological scenes, landscapes, or architectural illusions. They upgraded bath facilities and expanded dining rooms. These choices suggest long-term thinking. Residents expected to enjoy these improvements for years to come. The rhythm of the day structured expectations. Morning hours were devoted to work and errands. Midday brought a lull, especially in warmer months, when people retreated indoors. Afternoons saw renewed activity, with visits to the baths or meetings in public spaces. Evenings were reserved for meals and rest. This predictable cycle shaped how people interpreted unusual events. Anything that disrupted it was measured against the assumption that normality would soon return. The natural environment rarely intruded into these routines in dramatic ways. Occasional tremors were noticed, but not always recorded. They were part of life in Italy, not unique to Campania. Without a framework for understanding volcanic behaviour, such signs did not prompt evacuation or large-scale concern. They were explained away, joked about, or simply endured. Children grew up playing in the streets, learning trades from parents, and absorbing the habits of their community. Elderly residents remembered earlier hardships and recoveries, reinforcing the belief that the city had survived worse. Memory itself became a stabilising force, shaping expectations based on what had already been endured. Pompeii's location also contributed to its sense of security. It was not an isolated settlement. Roads connected it to other towns and to the wider empire. News travelled regularly. Officials moved between communities. If serious danger threatened, people assumed they would hear about it in time. The absence of warning from authorities or religious institutions further reinforced calm. In this environment, the mountain remained in the background. It framed views and influenced agriculture, but it did not dominate thought. People oriented themselves by streets and buildings, not by geological features. The city's identity was human-made, defined by walls, monuments, and social relationships. As summer progressed, daily life continued without interruption. Markets stayed busy, repairs advanced slowly, new paintings dried on freshly plastered walls. The town prepared for seasonal changes as it always had. There was no collective sense of living on borrowed time. The events that would soon unfold would not erase this way of life all at once. Instead, they would intrude gradually, testing habits and assumptions piece by piece. To understand how people responded, it is necessary to remember how deeply embedded these routines were, and how reasonable it seemed to trust them. From the crowded streets of Pompeii, the story will soon shift toward its quieter neighbour by the sea, where life followed a different rhythm, and where the coming disaster would take a very different form. Herculaneum by the sea. Herculaneum did not announce itself in the same way Pompeii did. Where Pompeii spread outward with busy streets and public noise, Herculaneum felt inward-looking, measured, and restrained. The town was smaller, its population only a fraction of its neighbours, and its streets were laid out with a neatness that suggested careful planning rather than organic growth. It sat closer to the shoreline, perched above the water on a gentle rise, giving many of its homes wide views of the Bay of Naples. The sea shaped life here in quiet ways. Fishing boats were part of the daily background, not dramatic but dependable. The shoreline was not dominated by large harbours or warehouses, but by modest maritime activity that supported local needs. Travel by sea was common for residents, especially those with wealth, and Herculaneum served as a convenient coastal retreat rather than a commercial engine. The character of the town reflected its residents. Many households belonged to members of the Roman elite, senators, equestrians, or successful freedmen whose fortunes allowed them to choose comfort over convenience. Their homes were built with attention to privacy and climate. Upper floors caught breezes from the sea. Thick walls moderated heat. Courtyards were smaller than those in Pompeii, but often more refined, with carefully arranged columns, fountains, and painted walls. Architecture in Herculaneum showed a preference for vertical space. Houses rose higher, sometimes 2 or 3 stories, supported by sturdy frameworks. Balconies and upper rooms overlooked streets that were quieter and cleaner than those of Pompeii. Traffic was lighter. There were fewer shops opening directly onto the road, and less mixing of commercial and domestic space. Business still existed, but it did not dominate the public face of the town. Social life unfolded largely indoors. Meals were events of display and connection, hosted in rooms designed to impress guests with painted scenes, polished marble, and thoughtful layout. Bathing was important here as well, though the baths of Herculaneum were smaller and more intimate. They served as places for conversation and relaxation rather than spectacle. Slavery was present in Herculaneum just as it was across the Roman world, but its expression differed subtly. Enslaved people worked within households, managing daily tasks and maintaining these elaborate residences. Some lived in small rooms tucked beneath staircases or along service corridors. Their labour made leisure possible, but it remained mostly invisible to those passing through the streets. Public spaces existed, but they did not dominate the town's identity. The forum was modest. Temples were fewer and less imposing. Civic life mattered, but it did not overwhelm private concerns. Herculaneum's residents were often more invested in family networks and personal reputation than in local political competition. The town's calm atmosphere reflected this focus. The earlier earthquake had affected Herculaneum less severely than Pompeii. Damage occurred, but fewer structures collapsed, and repairs were easier to manage. This relative stability reinforced the belief that the town was well situated and safe. Its position above the sea seemed to protect it from flooding. Its distance from major fault lines, as understood at the time, suggested resilience. As in Pompeii, religious practice blended seamlessly into daily life. Household shrines occupied small but deliberate spaces. Offerings were made regularly, without urgency. The gods were part of the background order of things, invoked for protection and gratitude rather than out of fear. The sea itself carried religious meaning, but again, in a familiar rather than threatening way. The rhythm of life in Herculaneum was slower. Days passed without the constant noise of carts and crowds. Evenings were quieter. Sounds carried differently here. Waves against the shore, distant voices, footsteps on stone. This calm shaped expectations. Sudden disaster felt unlikely in such an environment. Stability seemed built into the landscape. Children in Herculaneum grew up within these enclosed worlds, learning social manners and household responsibilities rather than street trades. Education mattered, especially for families with ambition. Tutors instructed young boys in reading, writing, and rhetoric. Girls learned household management and social grace. The future imagined for them was orderly and predictable. Time itself felt generous. Projects were planned carefully. Renovations were undertaken with patience. The town was not rushing toward growth or change. It had already achieved what many Romans desired: comfort, beauty, and a connection to nature that felt balanced rather than precarious. The presence of the mountain was even less intrusive here than in Pompeii. From some angles it was partially hidden. From others it appeared distant, softened by atmospheric haze. It did not loom over the town. It simply existed, part of the broader landscape that framed the bay. This physical separation would later matter in ways no one could foresee. The same mountain would affect Pompeii and Herculaneum differently, not because of chance alone, but because of geography, wind, and distance. Yet none of this was part of local thinking. No one planned for separate outcomes. No one imagined that proximity to the sea might increase danger rather than reduce it. As the summer of 79 AD continued, Herculaneum remained at ease. Its houses sheltered people who felt protected by wealth, design, and location. Its streets carried no hint of urgency. The town's quiet confidence mirrored that of Pompeii, though expressed in a different key. Soon the events unfolding beneath the mountain would begin to test these assumptions. The difference would not be immediately obvious. At first, the signs would seem minor, easily explained within existing habits of thought. But as conditions changed, the contrast between these two towns would become critical. For now, life continued gently along the coast, shaped by sea air and routine. The calm of Herculaneum, like that of Pompeii, was real, earned, and deeply believed in. That belief would guide how people responded when the ground itself began to challenge it. The Roman view of nature. For the people of Pompeii and Herculaneum, the natural world was not something separate from human life. It was woven into daily routines, religious customs, and practical decisions. Romans did not divide experience into natural and unnatural events in the modern sense. Instead, they saw the environment as active, sometimes unpredictable, but fundamentally part of the same order that governed human affairs. This worldview shaped how unusual events were interpreted. Earthquakes, storms, floods, and fires were familiar across the Roman world. Italy, in particular, experienced frequent seismic activity. Small tremors were common enough that many people barely reacted to them. Larger quakes caused damage and loss of life, but even these were seen as temporary disruptions rather than signs of permanent danger. The assumption was that cities could be rebuilt and life would continue. Roman writers offered explanations for earthquakes that mixed observation with philosophy. Some believed they were caused by air trapped underground, moving and struggling to escape. Others thought shifting water or fire beneath the earth played a role. These ideas were debated but not tested in ways that would lead to systematic understanding. What mattered more was how people responded socially and religiously. Religion provided a framework for meaning rather than prediction. When disasters struck, they were interpreted as expressions of divine will, often in response to human behavior. The solution was ritual, sacrifices, prayers, public ceremonies. These actions were meant to restore balance, not to analyze causes. Once the rituals were performed, confidence could return. This approach encouraged endurance rather than avoidance. If the gods were displeased, people sought to appease them. If damage occurred, communities repaired what was broken. There was little incentive to abandon valuable land because of a threat that could not be clearly defined or anticipated. Volcanoes occupied an especially uncertain place in Roman thought. While there were places in the Mediterranean where volcanic activity was visible, such as Mount Etna, these sites were seen as exceptions rather than part of a broader pattern. Etna was famous precisely because it was unusual. Its eruptions were described in poetry and history as wonders or curiosities, not as models for understanding other landscapes. The mountain near Pompeii did not fit the image of a volcano as Romans understood it. It showed no fire, no smoke, no dramatic signs of activity. Its slopes were cultivated. Its forests were used for timber. From the Roman perspective, it behaved like an ordinary mountain. There was no category that neatly connected it to known volcanic phenomena. The language Romans used to describe the land reinforced this perception. Campania was praised for its fertility. The soil was rich, dark, and productive. Farmers knew that this soil produced strong vines and abundant crops, but they did not associate that fertility with past eruptions. The connection between volcanic ash and agricultural richness was not part of common knowledge. Even the earthquakes that struck the region were interpreted within existing expectations. The major quake of 62 AD was severe, but not unprecedented in the Roman world. Cities in Asia Minor, Greece, and Italy had suffered similar events. Some recovered quickly, others more slowly, but recovery was assumed. Pompeii's long rebuilding process was frustrating, but it was also familiar. Importantly, the quake did not coincide with visible changes in the mountain. There was no obvious reason to link the two. Without a conceptual framework connecting earthquakes to volcanic eruptions, people treated each phenomenon separately. One did not automatically suggest the other. Roman engineering also contributed to a sense of control over nature. Aqueducts carried water across long distances. Roads cut through difficult terrain. Harbours reshaped coastlines. These achievements reinforced confidence in human ability to manage the environment. While nature could disrupt plans, it could also be mastered and redirected. This confidence was practical rather than arrogant. Romans knew they were vulnerable to disease, fire, and weather. But vulnerability was part of life, not a reason to retreat. Communities invested in infrastructure precisely because it allowed them to respond to challenges. The idea of preemptively abandoning a thriving town because of a poorly understood risk would have seemed unreasonable. Communication played a role as well. Information travelled through official channels, personal letters, and word of mouth. If serious danger threatened, people expected authorities or religious leaders to respond. The absence of warnings reinforced calm. There was no announcement, no decree, no collective signal that something unprecedented was imminent. The Roman calendar also shaped perception. Time was organised around religious festivals, market days, and agricultural cycles. These rhythms gave structure to uncertainty. When something unusual happened, it was placed within this calendar, given meaning by its timing rather than by its cause. An earthquake near a festival might be interpreted differently from one at another time, but neither would necessarily provoke evacuation. In Pompeii and Herculaneum, these habits of thought were deeply ingrained. They shaped how people noticed, discussed, and dismissed small irregularities. A tremor might be mentioned briefly, then forgotten. A change in water flow might be attributed to maintenance issues. Even a series of small disturbances would not automatically combine into a larger warning. The Roman approach to nature emphasized continuity. The past was used to predict the future, but only within the limits of memory. Because no one remembered an eruption here, none was expected. History, as people experienced it, suggested stability. This does not mean Romans were indifferent or careless. They paid attention to signs they knew how to interpret. They consulted priests, observed omens, and recorded unusual events. But interpretation depended on categories that already existed. The idea that a familiar mountain could suddenly erase entire towns lay outside those categories. As a result, when the first unmistakable signs of eruption appeared, they did not immediately register as part of a known pattern. They were strange, confusing, and difficult to place. People responded by observing, waiting, and adapting, rather than fleeing at once. Understanding this mindset is essential. The story of Pompeii and Herculaneum is not one of ignorance or stubbornness. It is a story of reasonable people acting within the limits of their knowledge. Their decisions were shaped by experience, culture, and trust in systems that had worked before. As summer moved toward its end, these assumptions remained intact. The towns continued to function, the land continued to provide, the mountain remained quiet. Soon, the earth would force a re-evaluation of everything people thought they knew about their environment. But that moment had not yet arrived. For now, the Roman view of nature still held, steady and reassuring, even as unseen forces gathered beneath the ground. Earthquakes before the eruption. Long before the eruption of 79 AD, the ground beneath Campania had already shown signs of unease. Earthquakes were part of the region's lived experience, familiar enough to be unsettling but not alarming enough to provoke abandonment. People remembered them the way they remembered storms or bad harvests, as disruptions that tested patience and resources, not as signs that the land itself was unsafe. The most significant of these events occurred in 62 AD, when a powerful earthquake struck Pompeii and surrounding towns. Contemporary writers described widespread damage. Buildings cracked or collapsed. Temples lost columns. Public spaces were scarred. In some areas, entire streets were affected at once. For many residents, it was the most destructive natural event they had experienced in their lifetime. Yet the response to the earthquake revealed much about Roman resilience. Rather than leaving, people rebuilt. The process was slow and uneven, but it was visible everywhere. In Pompeii, walls were reinforced with brick, where stone had failed. Older decorative styles were replaced with newer ones. Some properties changed hands, creating opportunities for investment. Construction became a common sight, and with it came a sense of renewal. Herculaneum suffered less severe damage, but it too showed signs of repair. Cracks were patched, structural elements were strengthened. Because the town was smaller and wealthier on average, recovery there was more efficient. This difference reinforced the perception that location and planning mattered, and that sensible building could manage natural risk. Over the following years, smaller tremors continued to occur. These were noted casually, sometimes joked about, sometimes ignored. They rarely caused significant damage. Their familiarity reduced their impact. When the ground shook briefly, people paused, then returned to their tasks. Children learned early how to stand still or brace themselves, then move on. This normalization mattered. It shaped how later disturbances were interpreted. Without a clear escalation in severity, there was no reason to assume that the earlier earthquake had been a warning of something larger. Instead, it was treated as a discrete event, part of a known pattern. The long rebuilding period in Pompeii also contributed to this mindset. Repairs stretched on for years, not because people lacked urgency, but because resources and labour took time to organise. This ongoing construction became background noise. Scaffolding, rubble piles, and half-finished walls blended into the urban environment. When the ground trembled again, it was easy to blame construction weaknesses rather than deeper forces. Economic incentives reinforced staying put. Campania's productivity was unmatched. Vineyards produced valuable wine. Trade routes ensured steady income. Abandoning property meant abandoning investment, status, and livelihood. The rational choice, given what people knew, was to remain and adapt. There was also a psychological dimension. Communities that survived disaster often develop confidence in their ability to endure. The earthquake of 62 AD had tested Pompeii and Herculaneum, and both had survived. This experience became proof of resilience rather than a source of fear. Memory worked selectively, emphasizing recovery over vulnerability. Religious interpretation played its part as well. After the earthquake, rituals were performed, temples repaired, and offerings made. The absence of further catastrophe reinforced the belief that balance had been restored. The gods, it seemed, had been appeased. There was no reason to expect renewed punishment. As years passed, new generations grew up with only second-hand knowledge of the quake. For them, cracked walls were simply part of the landscape, reminders of an event they had not personally experienced. The emotional weight faded. What remained was routine. In this context, subtle changes in the environment were difficult to interpret. If wells behaved strangely or animals reacted unpredictably, such signs were isolated rather than connected. There was no shared framework that linked these observations into a coherent warning. The Roman world valued precedent. Decisions were guided by what had happened before. Because nothing like a volcanic eruption had occurred within living memory, there was no precedent to guide action. Even those who sensed unease lacked a language to express it convincingly. By the late summer of 79 AD, the memory of the earthquake had settled into history. It influenced architecture and conversation but did not dominate thought. People focused on present concerns, trusting that whatever challenges arose could be managed as they had been before. This trust would soon be tested. The earth had already spoken once, decades earlier, and been answered with confidence and repair. When it spoke again, the response would be shaped by that same experience, for better and for worse. The final summer of 79 AD. By the time the summer of 79 AD arrived, life in Campania had settled into a familiar seasonal rhythm. The intense heat of midsummer shaped daily routines, but it did so in ways people understood well. Work began earlier in the morning. Midday hours slowed, with shutters closed and streets quieter. Activity returned in the late afternoon and evening, when the sun dropped lower and the air cooled. This pattern was not new, and it carried with it a sense of reassurance. Seasons changed, but the shape of life remained recognizable. In Pompeii, the final summer was marked by activity rather than hesitation. Reconstruction from earlier earthquake damage continued, but it no longer felt like recovery from disaster. It felt like improvement. Some homes showed fresh plaster and newly painted walls. Others were in the middle of renovation, with construction materials stacked neatly along the street. This was not the appearance of a city in decline. It was a city investing in its future. Markets remained busy. Agricultural goods arrived daily from the surrounding countryside. Fruit vendors sold figs, grapes, and early apples. Olive oil and wine moved through shops in steady quantities. Bakers continued to produce bread in large ovens that served entire neighborhoods. The economy functioned smoothly, supported by trade routes that connected Pompeii to nearby towns and ports. The presence of visitors reinforced this sense of normalcy. Campania attracted travellers from across Italy, drawn by its climate and reputation. Villas along the coast were occupied during the warmer months by wealthy Romans, seeking relief from the heat of the capital. Pompeii benefited from this movement of people. Taverns, inns, and shops served both locals and outsiders. Conversations in the streets carried accents from different regions, reminding residents that their town was part of a larger world. Political life also continued without interruption. Local officials carried out their duties. Legal disputes were heard. Public announcements were posted. Elections, where relevant, were discussed and debated. These processes depended on the assumption that the city would continue to function. No one paused civic business in anticipation of catastrophe. Religious observance followed the calendar. Festivals were prepared for and observed as they had been for generations. Offerings were made. Processions moved through streets. These events reinforced continuity, linking the present summer to countless others before it. Religion did not signal alarm. Instead, it confirmed stability. Herculaneum shared this seasonal calm, though expressed differently. Its quieter streets felt even more subdued in the heat. Houses were designed to manage temperature, with shaded courtyards and upper rooms that caught breezes from the sea. Families spent more time indoors during the hottest hours, emerging later in the day to walk along the shoreline or visit neighbours. The sea itself was central to summer life in Herculaneum. Fishing continued steadily, with boats leaving early and returning by midday. The water offered both food and relief from heat. Some residents swam or bathed near the shore. Others simply enjoyed the cooling effect of the air moving over the water. The coastline felt safe and familiar. In both towns, households prepared for the months ahead. Storage jars were filled, repairs were scheduled, plans were made for travel or business in the autumn. These preparations reveal something important. People were thinking forward. They expected to be present to see these plans unfold. There were, however, subtle irregularities. Some residents may have noticed small tremors, slight enough to be dismissed. In a region accustomed to earthquakes, such sensations did not demand attention. They were part of the background, like distant thunder or shifting weather. Other changes were harder to interpret. Wells may have behaved unpredictably, though evidence for this remains uncertain. Animals might have acted oddly at times, but animal behaviour was rarely seen as a reliable warning. Any single unusual observation could be explained away. Without a framework to connect these signs, they remained isolated. The mountain itself showed no dramatic transformation that people could clearly recognise. It did not emit smoke or fire. Its outline remained unchanged. Vegetation still covered its slopes. From a distance, it appeared as it always had. The absence of obvious danger reinforced trust in the landscape. Memory played a powerful role during this summer. Older residents remembered the earthquake of 62 AD and the disruption it caused, but they also remembered recovery. They remembered rebuilding, adaptation, and return to routine. This memory shaped expectations. If the ground shook again, they believed they could handle it. Younger residents had even less reason for concern. For many, the earthquake was something they knew only through stories or through cracks in walls that had long since been repaired. Their lived experience was one of relative stability. They had no reason to imagine that the land beneath them could suddenly become uninhabitable. This generational difference mattered. A society's sense of risk is shaped not just by events, but by how recently they occurred. By 79 AD, the earthquake was nearly 2 decades in the past. It had become history, not a present threat. Daily routines continued to reinforce this sense of safety. Children attended lessons or helped in family businesses. Slaves carried out household tasks. Artisans worked in their shops. Bathhouses opened and closed on schedule. These repetitive actions created a rhythm that made disruption harder to imagine. In Pompeii, the amphitheatre and other entertainment venues remained part of social life. While there is no evidence of major games immediately before the eruption, the infrastructure and culture of spectacle were intact. Leisure was expected to return as it always did. The presence of ongoing construction deserves particular attention. In many ways, it symbolized confidence. People do not renovate homes or invest in decoration if they expect to leave soon. Fresh wall paintings in particular suggest optimism. These paintings required time and money. They were not temporary measures. Some houses show evidence of storage rooms being filled, possibly in preparation for seasonal changes or travel. This again points to forward planning rather than panic. Nothing about the archaeological record suggests widespread fear or evacuation before the eruption began. Communication between towns also continued normally. Roads remained open. Travel was common. If rumours of danger had circulated widely, they would likely have left traces in behaviour. Instead, movement appears steady and unremarkable. The Roman administrative system was sensitive to serious threats. Imperial officials responded to fires, floods, and unrest when necessary. The absence of intervention or warning from higher authorities suggests that no recognised emergency existed before the eruption. This does not mean that absolutely no one felt unease. In any society, individuals respond differently to uncertainty. Some may have felt nervous about tremors or changes in the environment, but individual anxiety does not easily translate into collective action without shared understanding. The summer heat itself may have contributed to complacency. High temperatures slowed activity and dulled urgency. People rested more, conserving energy. This slower pace made it easier to postpone decisions and interpret unusual signs as minor inconveniences rather than warnings. As days passed, the ordinary accumulated. One uneventful day followed another. The absence of crisis reinforced the belief that none was coming. This pattern is familiar in hindsight. The normality of the immediate past shapes expectations of the future. The calendar moved forward. August progressed toward its end. The harvest season approached. The social and economic machinery of the towns continued to turn. No official record marks these weeks as exceptional. It is important to resist the temptation to read inevitability into this period. From the perspective of those living through it, the final summer was not tense or ominous. It was simply summer. The idea that this season would be remembered for catastrophe did not exist. The relationship between people and place remained intact. Pompeii and Herculaneum were not seen as fragile settlements clinging to dangerous land. They were seen as successful communities rooted in productive territory. This belief had been confirmed by decades of experience. Even the presence of the mountain, silent and unchanged, reinforced calm. Familiarity breeds trust. When a landscape behaves consistently over generations, it becomes part of identity. People define themselves in relation to it. Questioning its safety would have meant questioning the foundation of daily life. As the final days approached, there was no mass departure, no visible preparation for disaster. Life did not pause. It flowed forward, guided by habit, memory, and expectation. The events that would soon begin were not preceded by clear alarms or dramatic shifts. They emerged into a world that believed itself stable. Understanding this context is essential because it explains not only what happened, but how people responded once change became impossible to ignore. The final summer of 79 AD was ordinary in every visible way. That ordinariness, preserved in ash and memory, is what makes the story of Pompeii and Herculaneum so enduring. It reminds us that the edge of disaster often looks exactly like the middle of everyday life. Morning of the eruption, the morning that would later be remembered as the beginning of the eruption, did not arrive with drama. Dawn came as it always had, light spreading gradually over the Bay of Naples, touching rooftops, streets, and the familiar outline of the mountain. In Pompeii and Herculaneum, people woke to ordinary sounds. Footsteps in neighbouring houses, the movement of animals, voices calling from courtyards, the creak of shutters opening to let in air. In Pompeii, shops opened as usual. Bakers were already at work, drawing loaves from their ovens. Water flowed from public fountains, splashing into stone basins. Slaves moved through streets carrying containers, sweeping thresholds, preparing for the day's tasks. There was nothing about the early hours that suggested a break from routine. The city functioned on habit, and habit held firm. Somewhere in the late morning, subtle changes began to appear. They were not immediately alarming. A faint trembling may have been felt by some, gentle enough to be dismissed as another minor earthquake. In a region accustomed to such movements, this did not provoke panic. People paused, waited, and continued what they were doing. Then came a sight that was unfamiliar, but not instantly terrifying. Above the mountain, a column began to rise. At first, it may have been mistaken for a cloud forming in an unusual way. It climbed upward, narrow at the base and expanding as it rose, spreading outward at the top. For those who noticed it early, it was strange rather than frightening. The sky sometimes produced odd formations, and without context, this was simply another curiosity. As the column grew taller and darker, attention increased. People stopped in the streets to look. Conversations formed briefly, speculative and uncertain. The cloud did not move like smoke from a fire. It rose steadily, with a shape that seemed both solid and changing. Still, there was no immediate sense of danger. Curiosity outweighed fear. In Herculaneum, the view of the mountain was partially obscured by buildings and terrain, but those with a clear line of sight would have seen the same development. From the coast, the column stood out against the sky, its height making it visible from great distances. Boats at sea may have turned toward it, their crews trying to understand what they were seeing. The eruption itself began with a violent release of material from deep underground, but this was not yet obvious to those on the surface. What they saw was the result: ash, gas, and rock, propelled upward with enormous force. The sound accompanying this release may have been heard as a distant roar or series of deep rumblings, but sound travels unpredictably, and not everyone would have registered it clearly. As time passed, small particles began to fall from the sky. At first, this may have seemed like light debris, easily brushed from clothing. The material was unfamiliar, but not immediately harmful. People wiped it from their faces and hair, more annoyed than afraid. Life continued, though with increasing distraction. The decision-making process during these early hours is difficult to reconstruct in detail, but patterns emerge from what was left behind. There was no sudden mass flight. Doors were not thrown open all at once. Instead, people hesitated. They watched. They waited for clearer signs. Some individuals chose to leave early. Travellers already on the road may have quickened their pace. Others may have gathered valuables and prepared to depart. But these actions were individual, not coordinated. There was no announcement, no shared instruction. Each person interpreted the situation through their own experience and judgment. The ash fall gradually intensified. In Pompeii, it accumulated on roofs and streets. The sky dimmed, though it did not immediately turn dark. Breathing became uncomfortable for some, especially those with existing health problems. Still, the danger was not obvious. Ash does not look deadly. It looks like dust, something to be endured rather than escaped. People took shelter indoors, closing doors and windows. Houses were solid structures, designed to withstand weather and minor earthquakes. Going inside felt sensible. Staying close to home allowed families to remain together and protected possessions. Leaving meant uncertainty. In Herculaneum, conditions were different. The wind carried much of the ash inland, toward Pompeii. Ash fall near the coast was lighter at first. This difference would later prove crucial, but in the morning hours it reinforced calm. Residents there had even less reason to flee. The sky may have looked strange, but the ground remained relatively clear. Throughout the morning, the column above the mountain continued to grow. It reached heights no cloud ever reached. Those who stared long enough may have noticed that it changed colour and shape, darkening as heavier material rose and fell. But without a concept of volcanic eruption, these observations did not translate into clear conclusions. The Roman world did not have emergency protocols for events like this. There were no sirens, no organised evacuations. Authority was local and reactive. Without direct orders, people relied on personal judgment and social cues. Because many stayed, others followed. As the hours passed, the environment became more uncomfortable. Ash fell more steadily. Visibility decreased. Sounds were muffled. The familiar outlines of buildings softened under a thin grey layer. Streets that had been busy in the morning grew quieter as people retreated indoors. Inside houses, conditions varied. Some structures offered good protection, with strong roofs and enclosed courtyards. Others were less secure, especially those already weakened by earlier earthquakes. Ash accumulated silently above, its weight increasing gradually. People checked on neighbours. Slaves moved between rooms, adjusting shutters and clearing debris where possible. Conversations focused on immediate concerns, whether to stay or leave, whether conditions would worsen, whether this strange event would soon pass. In many cases, past experience guided decisions. Earthquakes came and went, storms cleared, fires were contained. The assumption was that this too would resolve itself. Waiting seemed reasonable. By midday, the light had changed noticeably. The sun was obscured, casting a dull, filtered glow. This was unsettling, but still not unprecedented. Dust storms and heavy cloud cover could produce similar effects. The mind searched for familiar explanations. In Pompeii, some roofs began to show strain as ash piled up. This process was slow. There was no sudden collapse, no immediate alarm. The danger lay in accumulation, not impact. People inside could not easily see what was happening above them. Those who ventured outside faced growing difficulty. Breathing became harder. Ash irritated eyes and throats. Footing on the streets was uncertain. The surfaces grew slippery. Yet movement was still possible, and some chose this moment to leave, carrying bundles of belongings or guiding family members toward the city gates. Others hesitated, torn between conflicting instincts. Leaving meant exposure to falling material and uncertainty about where to go. Staying meant trusting walls and roofs that had sheltered them before. There was no clearly correct choice, only imperfect options. In Herculaneum, the morning passed with fewer immediate hardships. Ashfall remained light. Life slowed but did not stop entirely. Some residents watched the mountain from balconies or upper rooms, trying to make sense of the spectacle. The sea remained calm. Boats stayed near shore. This contrast between the two towns created a false sense of security. Conditions in one place did not necessarily predict conditions in another, but people naturally extrapolated from their immediate surroundings. If things were manageable here, perhaps they were manageable everywhere. As the eruption continued, the mountain did not give a single clear signal of escalation. Instead, it produced a steady stream of unfamiliar phenomena that demanded interpretation. Humans are slow to reclassify experiences, especially when doing so requires abandoning deeply held assumptions. By the end of the morning, it was clear that something significant was happening, but it was not yet clear what that something was. The lack of clarity delayed decisive action. People waited for the event to declare itself more fully. This waiting, this pause between observation and understanding, defined the morning hours. It was a time of uncertainty without panic, of disruption without immediate collapse. The towns were still standing. Families were still together. The day was not yet lost. What would follow in the afternoon and night would push beyond these limits, forcing decisions under far harsher conditions. But the morning remained a space of possibility, where the outcome was not yet obvious, and where ordinary habits still shaped extraordinary circumstances. Ash over Pompeii. As the morning gave way to afternoon, the experience of the eruption in Pompeii changed in ways that were no longer easy to ignore. What had begun as an unusual sight in the sky now asserted itself at ground level, altering how people moved, breathed, and thought. The ash that had fallen lightly earlier in the day thickened into a steady descent, coating streets, rooftops, and open courtyards with increasing speed. At first, the accumulation seemed manageable. People swept doorways and cleared small piles from thresholds. Some climbed onto roofs to brush away debris, aware that weight mattered, even if they did not fully grasp how much. Ash slid off in soft sheets, puffing into the air and settling again. This repetitive effort created a sense of control, the feeling that the situation could still be handled through ordinary means. Visibility continued to decline. The sky took on a muted grey-brown tone that dulled colours and softened edges. Landmarks that were normally visible from across the city faded into the background. Sounds changed as well. Footsteps were muffled. Voices carried poorly. The city felt enclosed, as if wrapped in thick cloth. Breathing became a growing concern. Ash particles irritated the throat and lungs, especially for the elderly and those already in poor health. People wrapped cloth around their faces or pulled garments over their mouths. Inside homes, air grew stale. Opening doors or windows brought in more ash, but keeping them closed made breathing harder. Every choice carried a cost. Movement through the streets required effort. The once familiar paving stones were buried under a shifting layer that made footing uncertain. Raised stepping stones disappeared beneath the grey surface, removing a feature that usually helped pedestrians navigate wet or dirty streets. Carts became difficult to manoeuvre. Animals balked or moved slowly, confused by altered ground and air. Despite these challenges, Pompeii did not empty all at once. Instead, the city experienced a gradual thinning of activity. Some residents committed to leaving, while others stayed behind, hoping conditions would stabilise. This uneven response reflected the absence of shared information. Without knowing what would happen next, people relied on personal thresholds of discomfort and fear. Those who chose to flee faced their own difficulties. Leaving meant exposure to falling ash and the risk of getting lost as familiar routes vanished. City gates were not designed for mass evacuation under these conditions. Crowding may have occurred at certain exits, slowing movement and increasing anxiety. Carrying belongings made progress even harder. Many families stayed together indoors, retreating to interior rooms or upper floors. Homes with enclosed courtyards offered some protection, as ash could be partially contained or cleared. But even these spaces filled steadily. Ash filtered through openings, accumulated on ledges, and drifted down staircases. The interior of the city became as affected as its streets. As hours passed, the weight of ash on roofs became a silent threat. Roman roofs varied in strength, depending on materials and design. Some were supported by sturdy beams and could bear significant load, at least temporarily. Others were weaker, especially in buildings already compromised by earlier earthquakes or renovations. The danger lay not in sudden impact, but in gradual pressure. Ash does not announce its weight. It settles quietly, layer upon layer, until structural limits are exceeded. Inside, residents could hear subtle sounds: creaking wood, shifting tiles, the occasional crash from nearby buildings. Each noise carried meaning, but interpreting it was difficult. Fear did not always present itself as panic. Often it appeared as hesitation, as repeated reassessment. People moved belongings from one room to another, seeking safer spaces. They checked on neighbours. They waited for signs that might clarify whether to stay or go. Communication between households was limited by conditions. Shouting through streets was ineffective. Visibility was poor. People relied on proximity, calling out from doorways or through walls. Information spread unevenly, distorted by stress and uncertainty. As afternoon progressed, daylight dimmed further. The sun was completely obscured. Artificial light became necessary, and oil lamps were lit earlier than usual. These lamps added to the atmosphere of enclosure, casting small islands of light surrounded by shadow and drifting ash. Inside the forum and other public spaces, activity slowed dramatically. These areas offered little protection from falling debris. The focus of life shifted inward, away from communal spaces and toward private shelter. The social fabric of the city tightened, shrinking to the scale of households and immediate neighbours. The psychological strain of the situation should not be underestimated. Humans are accustomed to threats that are visible and directional. Fire approaches from one side, floodwater rises from below, ash fell from everywhere at once, without a clear source or endpoint. This made it harder to judge progress or improvement. Time itself became difficult to track. With daylight gone and routines disrupted, hours blurred together. People relied on internal cues, fatigue, hunger, fear rather than clocks or schedules. The ordinary markers of the day had vanished. Some residents may have attempted to leave later than they should have, driven by the realization that conditions were worsening rather than improving. These late departures were particularly dangerous. Ash was deeper. Visibility was lower. Breathing was more difficult. Yet the instinct to escape can override caution, especially when indoor shelter begins to feel unsafe. Evidence from the city suggests that many people remained inside until the very end. Their positions indicate attempts to protect themselves, not active movement. They gathered in groups, possibly believing that staying together increased chances of survival. This belief, while understandable, did not account for the specific nature of the threat. As the ash fall continued into evening, the city's architecture became a liability. Narrow streets trapped debris, flat roofs accumulated weight. Upper floors, once desirable for light and air, became more exposed. The built environment that had supported daily life now constrained options. Outside the city, the countryside experienced similar conditions. Though fewer structures meant fewer collapses, fields were buried, roads disappeared. Travellers caught between settlements faced extreme difficulty, unsure where safety lay. Throughout this period, there was no clear moment when Pompeii crossed from danger into doom. Instead, the situation deteriorated steadily. Each hour reduced the margin for error. Each decision became more consequential. The eruption did not discriminate. Wealth, status, and preparation offered limited protection. Stronger buildings lasted longer, but not indefinitely. Physical endurance mattered, but even the healthy struggled in the ash-choked air. As night approached, Pompeii was no longer recognizable as the city it had been that morning. Its streets were buried. Its skyline had vanished. Its people were enclosed within shrinking pockets of breathable air and structural stability. The ash that fell was not yet the final blow. It was a slow, suffocating pressure that tested patience, strength, and judgment. Many endured it for hours, hoping that dawn would bring relief. What they could not know was that the most destructive phase of the eruption still lay ahead, and that time itself had become the enemy. Night falls, roofs collapse. Night did not arrive in Pompeii in the usual way. There was no gradual fading of colour, no clear moment when daylight surrendered to darkness. Instead, the world dimmed unevenly, hour by hour, until the difference between afternoon and night lost its meaning. The sky above the buried city remained heavy and opaque, lit only by the diffuse glow of fire and lightning within the eruption cloud. For those inside houses, darkness came early and stayed. Oil lamps became essential. Their small flames flickered in air thick with ash, casting uncertain light that barely reached beyond the nearest walls. Shadows multiplied. Corners vanished. Every movement stirred dust, sending fine particles drifting through the air. Breathing grew more laboured as time passed, even for those who had managed reasonably well during the day. By this point, the weight of ash had become a critical factor. Roofs that had tolerated hours of accumulation began to fail. The process was not dramatic at first. Wooden beams creaked and bent. Tiles shifted. Small sections collapsed with sudden noise, sending showers of debris into rooms below. Each collapse startled those nearby, but it also carried information. The buildings were reaching their limits. People reacted in different ways. Some fled collapsing rooms, moving deeper into their houses or down to lower floors. Others attempted to shore up weak points, propping beams or clearing ash where possible. These efforts were often futile. Clearing a roof from below was impossible, and venturing outside to remove ash exposed people to even greater danger. The streets outside were no refuge. By nightfall, Ash lay deep enough to make movement slow and exhausting. Visibility was nearly non-existent. Lamps or torches provided only minimal guidance, their light swallowed by the surrounding haze. Those who attempted to move through the city risked losing their way, falling, or being struck by debris from above. The sounds of the city changed again. Earlier there had been voices and activity. Now, the dominant noises were structural: crashes, groans, and the occasional roar from the mountain itself. These sounds were disorienting. It was difficult to tell how close danger was, or whether it was moving nearer or farther away. In many houses, families gathered in the strongest rooms they could find. Interior spaces without windows offered some protection from falling debris, but they also trapped air. People pressed cloth to their faces, shared water, and waited. Waiting was often the only option left. Leaving at this stage meant entering an environment that was actively hostile. As roofs failed, the risk of injury increased sharply. Falling tiles and beams caused immediate harm. Even partial collapses filled rooms with dust, making breathing nearly impossible for a time. Survivors of these incidents faced a difficult choice: remain in a compromised structure or attempt to move elsewhere in near-total darkness. Some buildings with vaulted ceilings or reinforced construction lasted longer. Public bath complexes, for example, had strong roofs designed to span large spaces. A few people may have sought refuge in such structures, believing them safer than private homes. But reaching them was dangerous, and they were not designed to hold large numbers of people for extended periods under these conditions. The accumulation of ash also affected the city's infrastructure. Doors jammed, staircases filled, upper floors became inaccessible. In some cases, people were trapped not by collapse, but by the simple inability to open an exit buried under debris. The city became a maze of sealed spaces. Psychological strain intensified, fatigue set in, hunger and thirst added to discomfort. The constant uncertainty waiting for the next sound, the next collapse wore people down. Fear did not always express itself as panic. Often, it appeared as stillness, as a decision to conserve energy and endure. The passage of time lost clarity. Without daylight or routine, hours blended together. Some people may have slept briefly, exhausted by effort and stress. Others remained awake, listening. Sleep offered temporary escape, but it also carried risk, as conditions could worsen without warning. Outside the city, conditions were no better. The countryside was buried under ash. Trees bent and broke under the weight. Fields disappeared. Roads were erased. Anyone attempting to travel at night faced extreme danger, with little chance of finding shelter. Throughout the night, the eruption continued to feed the ashfall. The column above the mountain remained active, releasing material that drifted down over the region. There was no sign of it weakening. If anything, the sustained nature of the eruption suggested that this was not a brief event. For those who had hoped the situation would resolve itself by nightfall, that hope faded. The persistence of ash, the structural failures, and the oppressive darkness made it clear that this was something beyond ordinary experience. Yet clarity came too late for many. Options narrowed as time passed. In Herculaneum, the night unfolded differently, though residents could not yet know how sharply their fate would diverge from that of Pompeii. Ash fall remained lighter, and roofs were not under the same immediate strain. This relative calm encouraged continued sheltering rather than flight. The sea, still visible and accessible, seemed like a possible escape route if needed. Back in Pompeii, the city's design worked against it. Dense construction and narrow streets amplified danger. The very features that had supported vibrant urban life now concentrated risk. The night exposed the limits of human planning in the face of forces that did not respect walls or routines. As hours passed, the cumulative effects of ash, darkness, and exhaustion pushed many to their physical limits. Survival depended on a fragile balance: enough shelter to avoid collapse, enough air to breathe, enough strength to respond if conditions changed again. That change would come, not as a continuation of what had already happened, but as something fundamentally different. The ash that had defined the day and night was only one phase of the eruption. Beneath it, a more violent force was preparing to move outward. By the time the night reached its deepest point, Pompeii was a city barely holding together, suspended between endurance and collapse. The people inside did not know that the eruption was about to enter its most lethal stage, one that would erase any remaining margin for survival. Herculaneum's deadly surge. While Pompeii endured a long, grinding ordeal under falling ash, the night in Herculaneum unfolded with a dangerous calm that concealed what was coming next. For many hours, the town's experience of the eruption seemed strangely restrained. Ash fell, but not in the suffocating quantities seen inland. Roofs remained largely intact. Streets were dusted rather than buried. To those sheltering inside their homes, the worst appeared to be passing overhead, rather than settling directly upon them. This difference mattered deeply, because it shaped decisions. Residents of Herculaneum had fewer immediate reasons to flee. Their air remained breathable. Their buildings stood firm. The sea lay close by, open and familiar, offering both psychological comfort and the possibility of escape. If danger worsened, people believed they would have time to respond. The town itself was well suited to sheltering. Many houses were solidly built, with thick walls and strong foundations. Upper stories provided distance from the ground, and interior rooms offered protection from falling debris. The architecture encouraged people to stay put, to wait, and to observe rather than to run. As night deepened, the eruption above the mountain changed in ways that were not visible from below. The towering column that had dominated the sky throughout the day began to lose its stability. The upward force that sustained it weakened. Instead of rising cleanly, parts of the column collapsed back toward the ground. This transition marked a shift from an eruption dominated by ashfall to one driven by fast-moving, ground-hugging clouds of superheated gas, ash, and rock. These clouds, known today as pyroclastic surges, behaved very differently from falling ash. They did not drift gently downward. They raced outward at extraordinary speed, following the contours of the land. They were dense, hot, and lethal. Unlike lava, they did not glow or move slowly. Unlike ashfall, they did not give hours of warning. The first of these surges swept down the slopes of the mountain in the early hours of the morning. It moved too quickly for anyone to see it coming. From the perspective of those in Herculaneum, there was no gradual escalation, no increasing discomfort to prompt action. One moment, conditions were difficult but manageable. The next, the town was engulfed. The surge reached Herculaneum in seconds. Its temperature was extreme, hot enough to cause fatal injury almost instantly. It carried fine ash and gases that penetrated every opening, every corridor, every enclosed space. Walls and doors offered no meaningful protection. The heat alone was enough to overwhelm the human body. People who had gathered in rooms, believing them safe, were struck where they stood or sat. There was no time to flee, no opportunity to adjust. The surge did not announce itself with sound that could be interpreted as a warning. By the time it was felt, it was already too late. Along the shoreline, a different scene had been unfolding. As conditions worsened earlier in the night, some residents of Herculaneum had moved toward the sea. This decision made sense based on what they knew. The coast offered open space, fresh air, and the possibility of escape by boat. The ashfall had been lighter there, and the water remained calm. Under a series of stone arches along the waterfront, people gathered. These structures, likely boat sheds or storage spaces, provided shelter from falling debris. Families clustered together, some bringing belongings, others bringing nothing but themselves. They waited for daylight, believing they had chosen the safest option available. When the pyroclastic surge reached the shoreline, these shelters became traps. The surge poured into the arches, filling them instantly with heat and gas. The confined spaces concentrated the effects. Those inside had no chance to escape. The evidence preserved there suggests that death was rapid, caused by the combined effects of heat and inhalation of toxic gases. Inside the town, the pattern was similar. People were found in rooms, hallways, staircases, and upper floors, all overtaken at once. Unlike Pompeii, where some individuals survived for many hours, Herculaneum's population was killed in a matter of moments during this phase. The physical effects of the surge extended beyond loss of life. Organic materials were carbonized, wooden structures were charred, objects were displaced or destroyed by the force of the flow. Yet the town was not buried under meters of ash in the same way Pompeii was. Instead, it was sealed by layers of volcanic material that preserved its structures in remarkable detail. This preservation can be misleading. The clarity of remains sometimes suggests a quieter end, but the reality was the opposite. The speed and intensity of the surge left no room for gradual adaptation or survival strategies. It was a sudden, overwhelming event. The difference between Pompeii and Herculaneum during the eruption highlights how geography and timing can determine outcomes. Herculaneum's position closer to the mountain and lower in elevation made it more vulnerable to surges. The same features that had protected it from heavy ashfall exposed it to far greater danger when the eruption shifted phase. From a human perspective, this outcome feels especially cruel. Those who stayed in Herculaneum often did so because conditions appeared safer than in Pompeii. Their choices were rational, based on observation and experience. They were not reckless. They simply lacked information that no one possessed. The suddenness of the surge meant that fear, as an emotion, had little time to develop. There was no prolonged panic, no drawn-out struggle. For many, the end came without conscious awareness of what was happening. This does not lessen the tragedy, but it does shape how we understand it. After the first surge, additional surges followed, further sealing the town. Each wave added material, compressing and preserving what lay beneath. The structures of Herculaneum were entombed rather than crushed, which is why so much of the town survives today in extraordinary condition. Silence followed. The town that had been alive only hours earlier was now inert, its people gone, its routines ended. The sea continued to move against the shore. The eruption continued elsewhere, but Herculaneum itself was finished as a living community. From a broader perspective, the fate of Herculaneum illustrates the unpredictability of natural disasters. Even within a small geographic area, experiences can differ radically. Survival is not determined solely by preparation or intelligence, but by factors beyond human control. In the hours that followed, no rescue was possible. The area remained dangerous. The eruption was ongoing. Any survivors elsewhere were focused on their own escape. The town's fate would remain unknown for centuries. The contrast between Pompeii's prolonged suffering and Herculaneum's sudden destruction challenges simple narratives of disaster. One was slow, incremental, and exhausting. The other was swift and final. Both were shaped by the same eruption, yet they unfolded according to different rules. For those studying these events today, Herculaneum offers a stark lesson in the limits of human perception. People respond to what they can see, feel, and understand. When danger does not fit familiar patterns, response is delayed. When danger arrives faster than thought, response becomes impossible. As dawn approached on that catastrophic day, Herculaneum lay sealed beneath volcanic material, its people preserved in the positions they had chosen for safety. The sea that had seemed like an escape route lapped quietly against a shore that no longer held living inhabitants. Meanwhile, Pompeii was still enduring its ordeal. Its people, battered but not yet finished, would soon face the same deadly force that had erased Herculaneum in moments. The eruption had entered its most violent phase, and its reach was not yet complete. The last hours at sea. The shoreline of the Bay of Naples became, during the later stages of the eruption, a place where certainty dissolved almost as completely as the towns behind it. For those who reached the coast, the land no longer offered clear shelter, yet the sea offered no guarantees. It was not an obvious escape route in the way roads usually were. It was an open, shifting surface, made more dangerous by darkness, ash, and fear. Still, for many, it represented the last remaining option. As ash continued to fall through the night, it settled on the water in thin, drifting layers. At first, these patches floated, creating strange, mottled patterns that moved with the waves. Oars cut through them, leaving brief trails that closed again almost immediately. The smell of sulphur and heated stone lingered above the surface, carried by shifting winds that made the air uneven and unpredictable. Boats that had already pushed off earlier were navigating under extreme conditions. Visibility was limited to short distances. The usual markers, headlands, villas, temples near the shore were either obscured or invisible. Navigation depended on experience, memory, and instinct rather than sight. Sailors listened to the water, felt the pull of currents, and tried to maintain direction despite gusts that arrived without warning. Ash made every task more difficult. It coated decks, clogged rigging, and irritated eyes. Rowers struggled to keep rhythm as fatigue set in. Sailors had to clear fabric repeatedly to prevent sails from becoming heavy and unresponsive. Every motion required effort, and effort consumed precious energy already depleted by hours of stress and poor breathing. For those still gathered along the shore, the night was long and uncertain. Some people had arrived early, before conditions deteriorated too severely. They brought with them bundles of belongings, containers of food or water, and sometimes small amounts of money or jewellery. Others arrived later with almost nothing, driven by the worsening situation inland rather than by preparation. The shoreline itself was uneven and changing. Volcanic material altered the ground beneath people's feet. In some places, ash mixed with water to form slippery, unstable surfaces. In others, debris accumulated in ridges that made movement awkward and exhausting. Standing still was uncomfortable, but moving was risky. Families clustered together, sharing limited resources and trying to maintain warmth as temperatures dropped. Summer nights by the sea could be cool even under normal conditions. With ash blocking heat from the eruption cloud overhead, the air felt heavy and cold at the same time. Wet clothing from waves or spray worsened discomfort. The psychological strain of waiting was immense. People listened for changes in sound, trying to interpret the distant roar from the mountain and the nearer crash of waves. Each new noise prompted speculation. Was the eruption weakening or intensifying? Was it safe to launch a boat now, or better to wait until morning? No one could answer with confidence. Some attempted to sleep in brief intervals, sitting upright or leaning against rocks and structures. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by coughing, shivering, or sudden noise. Others stayed awake, too tense to rest. Time passed slowly, measured not in hours but in endurance. The sea itself showed signs of disturbance beyond surface conditions. Subtle changes in wave behaviour suggested seismic activity beneath the water. Waves sometimes arrived out of sequence, breaking earlier or later than expected. This unpredictability made launching boats more dangerous. A poorly timed wave could capsize a small vessel or swamp it before it cleared the shore. Those who decided to launch during the night faced a moment of commitment. Pushing a boat into the water meant leaving behind whatever shelter the shore offered. It meant accepting exposure to wind, ash, and darkness. Once underway, turning back might not be possible. This decision was often made quickly, driven by fear or by the belief that waiting would only make things worse. Not all boats were seaworthy under these conditions. Some were damaged by falling debris. Others were overloaded with people desperate to escape. Weight affected stability, and in poor visibility, balancing loads became guesswork. Arguments may have broken out over space and priority, though evidence of such moments is lost to history. What remains clear is that not everyone who wanted to leave could do so. Along stretches of coast farther from Herculaneum, people witnessed the eruption from relative safety but still faced difficult choices. The darkened sky and falling ash signalled danger, but the scale and direction were unclear. Some towns lay outside the immediate danger zone, but feared that conditions might worsen. Others received boats carrying survivors, their passengers exhausted, injured, or in shock. These arrivals brought fragmented accounts of what had happened inland. Stories spread quickly but inconsistently. Some spoke of buildings collapsing under ash. Others described intense heat and sudden death near the mountain. The lack of a coherent picture made response difficult. People reacted to what they heard, filling gaps with imagination or assumption. Roman authorities were limited in their ability to respond. There was no centralized disaster response system. Local officials could offer shelter or supplies where available, but resources were quickly strained. The eruption affected a wide area simultaneously, limiting the ability of unaffected communities to assist. For those at sea who survived the night, dawn brought little relief. Light returned gradually, filtered through ash-laden clouds. The landscape revealed itself in altered form. Familiar coastlines were reshaped. Some landmarks were gone entirely. Others appeared strangely muted, their colours dulled by a uniform grey covering. The mountain remained active, though its behaviour had changed. The towering column was no longer rising as it had before, but the eruption was not over. Smaller plumes and clouds continued to emerge, and the air remained dangerous to breathe. Survivors at sea watched cautiously, unsure whether it was safe to approach land or better to remain offshore. Water supplies became an urgent concern. Boats carried limited fresh water, intended for short trips rather than extended stays. Ash contamination made it difficult to collect more from rainfall or coastal sources. Dehydration compounded exhaustion, especially for those who had spent hours coughing and struggling to breathe. Food was scarce. Some boats carried fish or provisions, but many did not. Hunger sharpened anxiety and reduced physical strength. Survivors had to balance the need to conserve energy with the need to act decisively. Emotional responses began to surface more clearly as immediate danger receded just enough to allow thought. People realized that homes, possessions, and loved ones had been left behind. Some understood that return was impossible. Others clung to hope that conditions might improve enough to retrieve what was lost. Grief, disbelief, and numbness coexisted. The shoreline became a place of separation not just between land and sea, but between past and future. Those who escaped by water entered an uncertain new phase of life. They were no longer residents of their towns in any meaningful sense. They were displaced, dependent on the goodwill and capacity of other communities. As the day progressed, more boats arrived at safer ports. Survivors disembarked, carrying stories and physical evidence of the disaster. Ash-covered clothing, burns, and injuries made the reality visible to those who had not seen it firsthand. Temporary shelters were improvised. Supplies were shared unevenly. For some, survival brought a burden of responsibility. They became witnesses, tasked with explaining what had happened to relatives, officials, and historians. Their accounts would shape understanding of the event for generations, even as details were lost or altered in retelling. The sea had not been a simple refuge. It demanded its own toll in strength, skill, and luck. Some who escaped the towns perished on the water, overcome by exhaustion or overwhelmed by conditions. Their stories did not survive, leaving gaps in the historical record. Those who endured carried forward a memory shaped by movement and uncertainty. Unlike those buried in Pompeii or Herculaneum, their experience was defined not by entombment but by flight. They had watched the familiar recede into darkness and ash, replaced by open water and fear. As the eruption gradually subsided in the following days, the coastline stabilized. Ash settled. The air cleared slowly, but the social landscape was permanently altered. Communities absorbed survivors unevenly. Some were welcomed, others struggled to find support. The last hours at sea were not a single moment, but a prolonged test. They required constant reassessment, physical effort, and emotional resilience. They were shaped by choices made under incomplete information and extreme pressure. In retrospect, the sea appears as both saviour and barrier. It allowed some to escape while preventing others from doing the same. It offered movement when land did not, but it also demanded skills and resources not everyone possessed. As the immediate crisis passed, attention would turn back toward the buried towns. Pompeii, unlike Herculaneum, still held people alive through much of this period. Its final moments were approaching, shaped not by the slow fall of ash alone, but by the same deadly force that had already swept the coast. The story now returns inland, to the city that had endured through night and collapse, and that would soon face an ending as sudden as it was irreversible. Silence and burial. When the final destructive phase reached Pompeii, it arrived not as a continuation of the slow ordeal the city had endured, but as a sudden transformation of conditions. The ashfall that had defined the previous day and night was no longer the primary threat. Instead, the eruption shifted decisively, and the same kind of force that had erased Herculaneum moved inland. In the early hours of the morning, while many residents of Pompeii were still sheltering where they had chosen to remain, the eruption column above the mountain collapsed further. What followed were waves of superheated gas, ash, and debris that raced outward at high speed. Unlike falling ash, these flows did not give time to react. They advanced along the ground, filling streets, courtyards, and buildings with lethal force. The first of these surges weakened structures that were already compromised. Doors were blown inward, walls cracked or collapsed outright. The air inside buildings became instantly unbreathable. Even those who had survived hours of ashfall were now exposed to a danger they could not escape by endurance alone. Unlike in Herculaneum, where death came almost immediately, Pompeii's end unfolded over a short sequence of surges. Each wave penetrated deeper into the city, compounding damage and sealing spaces that had briefly remained survivable. People who had moved to interior rooms or lower floors found that these choices no longer mattered. Heat and gas reached everywhere. The physical effects were decisive. Temperatures rose sharply. Fine ash-filled lungs and airways. Visibility dropped to nothing. Survival was no longer a matter of strength or judgment. It was determined by exposure, measured in seconds. After the surges passed, the city fell silent. The sounds that had filled the night, collapsing roofs, movement, voices ceased. What remained was a buried landscape, still warm, still unstable, but devoid of human activity. Pompeii was no longer a functioning town. It had become a sealed environment, its streets and buildings filled and covered by volcanic material. Over the following hours and days, additional ash and debris settled, smoothing the surface and filling remaining voids. Rain and gravity compacted layers, locking structures and bodies into place. The process was gradual, but the outcome was final. Pompeii disappeared from view. The scale of burial was immense. Entire buildings were submerged. Streets vanished. The city's outline faded beneath a uniform layer that concealed its complexity. From above, there was little to indicate that a large urban centre lay beneath the surface. Survivors elsewhere may have attempted to return or search for loved ones in the days that followed, but conditions made rescue impossible. The area remained dangerous. The ground was hot. Gases lingered. The extent of burial made excavation unrealistic with the tools available at the time. Gradually, efforts ceased. Memory began its slow work of simplification. The names of the towns remained known, but details blurred. Over time, references to Pompeii and Herculaneum shifted from present realities to past events. The land was eventually reused. Fields were planted. New paths crossed old streets without recognition. The silence that followed the eruption was not immediate emptiness, but a long quiet shaped by absence. Life continued elsewhere in Campania, but the buried towns did not re-emerge. They became part of the landscape in a different way, contributing to its fertility while remaining hidden within it. This silence would last for centuries. Beneath it, the cities waited, preserved not by intention but by circumstance. Their final moments were fixed in place, held beneath layers of ash and time, survivors and aftermath. When daylight finally returned to Campania after the eruption, it revealed a landscape that no longer functioned as a coherent place. The transition from night to morning did not restore normality. Instead, it exposed absence. Where towns had stood, there were smooth grey expanses. Where roads had run, there were shallow ridges and depressions with no clear direction. Smoke and steam rose unevenly from the ground, and the air carried a sharp mineral scent that lingered for days. Survivors encountered this scene gradually, often from a distance. Those who had escaped by sea or reached safer ground inland approached cautiously, unsure how stable the land was or whether further danger remained. The eruption had not ended cleanly. Small collapses, residual heat, and occasional gas releases made the area unpredictable. Returning immediately was neither safe nor practical. For those who had fled earlier, the realization of loss unfolded in stages. At first, survival itself demanded attention. Physical needs came before reflection. People needed water, food, shelter, and rest. Many were injured, suffering from burns, respiratory damage, or exhaustion. Ash in the lungs continued to cause problems even after the air cleared. Some survivors deteriorated days later, their bodies unable to recover from exposure. Only after immediate needs were addressed did the larger implications emerge. Homes were gone, businesses were buried, family members and neighbours were missing. Entire social networks had been erased. The survivors' identities, closely tied to place and property, were suddenly unstable. The Roman world was accustomed to displacement, but usually through war, colonization, or gradual economic change. Sudden natural catastrophe on this scale posed different challenges. Survivors from Pompeii and Herculaneum did not arrive as organized groups. They came in fragments, scattered across the region, often with little documentation to prove who they were or what they had owned. Roman society relied heavily on records, property deeds, citizenship rolls, contracts, and family archives. Many of these documents had been stored in homes or local administrative buildings that were now buried. Without them, claims became difficult to verify. Survivors faced not only grief but bureaucratic uncertainty. Local communities absorbed survivors unevenly. Some towns offered temporary shelter, especially to relatives or known associates. Wealthier survivors had more options. They could rely on extended networks, personal wealth carried with them, or influence in nearby cities. Poorer survivors often depended on charity or informal labour to survive. The Roman state did not launch a large-scale relief effort comparable to modern disaster responses. Imperial attention was often reactive and selective. Emperors responded to major fires or floods in Rome itself, but disasters in provincial towns were handled locally unless they threatened broader stability. There is evidence that Emperor Titus took an interest in the Campanian disaster, though the nature and extent of imperial involvement remain unclear. Funds may have been allocated for relief or resettlement, but these measures would have been limited in scope. The empire's priority was maintaining order, not restoring individual towns that no longer existed. Importantly, there was no expectation that Pompeii or Herculaneum would be rebuilt. Their burial was too deep, the land too unstable, and the cost too high. Unlike cities damaged by earthquakes or fire, these towns had vanished beneath meters of volcanic material. Excavation was beyond Roman capabilities. The practical decision was to abandon them. This abandonment marked a significant psychological shift. Cities were not meant to disappear. They could be damaged, sacked, or burned, but they usually returned. The idea that an entire urban centre could be erased by natural forces challenged assumptions about permanence and human control. Survivors had to adapt to this reality. Some relocated permanently to other Campanian towns such as Naples or Capua. Others moved farther afield, seeking opportunities where competition from fellow survivors was less intense. Over time, these movements reshaped regional demographics, though quietly and without formal acknowledgement. Economic consequences extended beyond the immediate loss of towns. Agricultural land near the eruption zone was disrupted, at least temporarily. Fields were buried or altered. Vineyards and orchards were destroyed. Trade routes were interrupted as roads disappeared and ports struggled with ash buildup. However, Campania's resilience as a region should not be underestimated. Volcanic soil, once settled and weathered, would eventually restore fertility. Over years and decades, agriculture recovered in many areas. The land did not become barren. In time, it again supported crops and settlement, though not in the same pattern as before. For survivors, recovery was uneven. Some rebuilt lives successfully, integrating into new communities and professions. Others remained on the margins, their losses too great to overcome easily. Slaves who survived faced particular uncertainty. Without households to return to, they might be sold, reassigned, or left to fend for themselves. Freedom did not automatically follow survival. Social memory of the disaster formed slowly. There were no monuments erected to Pompeii or Herculaneum. No annual rituals commemorated their loss. The Roman approach to catastrophe emphasized moving forward rather than dwelling on what was gone. Memory persisted in personal stories and scattered references rather than in public ceremony. Writers who mentioned the eruption did so as part of broader discussions about natural phenomena or imperial history. The human cost was acknowledged, but not explored in detail. Over time, the disaster became one event among many in the long narrative of the empire. This relative silence contributed to forgetting. As survivors died and new generations grew up, direct memory faded. Place names remained, but their physical reference were gone. The land above Pompeii and Herculaneum was reused without full awareness of what lay beneath. Yet forgetting was never complete. Occasionally remnants surfaced. Stone blocks appeared in fields. Fragments of walls were exposed by erosion. Farmers encountered hard layers beneath the soil that resisted ploughing. These signs hinted at buried structures, but without systematic investigation, they were curiosities rather than revelations. The experience of survival itself left lasting marks on individuals. Those who lived through the eruption carried trauma that did not have a formal language. Roman culture did not emphasize psychological healing. Suffering was endured privately or expressed through changes in behavior rather than through public discourse. Some survivors may have become more cautious, more attuned to natural signs. Others may have sought explanations through religion, interpreting survival as divine favor or loss as divine judgment. These interpretations helped individuals make sense of events, but did not alter broader societal attitudes toward natural risk. The aftermath of the eruption thus unfolded quietly. There was no single moment of recovery, no official end to the crisis. Instead, life resumed around the absence. The buried towns became blank spaces on the map, their functions absorbed elsewhere. This quiet absorption is one of the most striking aspects of the story. A disaster that would later define Pompeii and Herculaneum in historical memory did not dominate Roman consciousness at the time. It was significant, but it did not alter the trajectory of the empire. For the survivors, however, the impact was total. Their world had ended. What followed was not restoration, but replacement. New homes, new routines, new identities built on loss. As decades passed, the physical traces of Pompeii and Herculaneum continued to recede beneath soil and vegetation. Silence deepened. The land healed on the surface, even as it preserved what lay beneath. Forgotten cities. In the decades after the eruption, the absence of Pompeii and Herculaneum slowly became normal. This normalization did not happen all at once. At first, the loss was tangible. Survivors spoke of places that no longer existed. Names of streets, temples, and neighborhoods still circulated in conversation. People described homes that had been buried, shops that would never reopen, and routes that could no longer be followed. But as years passed, those references grew fewer, and then quieter, until they belonged mostly to memory rather than daily life. The Roman world was expansive and adaptable. When one town disappeared, others absorbed its functions. Trade routes shifted, administrative responsibilities were reassigned, markets reorganized. The empire did not pause to mourn in any formal sense. Its systems were designed to continue operating despite disruption, and in this case, they did exactly that. The physical landscape contributed to forgetting. Volcanic material settled and compacted. Rainfall and vegetation softened the surface. Fields were gradually reclaimed for agriculture where conditions allowed. Paths formed across the ash-covered land, guided by convenience rather than memory. Over time, it became possible to walk across the buried cities without realizing what lay beneath. Pompeii, in particular, disappeared beneath a relatively uniform layer of ash and pumice. Its buildings were not visible above ground. There were no towering ruins to attract attention, no dramatic silhouettes to provoke curiosity. What remained were subtle irregularities, patches of harder ground, occasional stone fragments, changes in soil colour. To those working the land generations later, these features were obstacles, not clues. Herculaneum, buried under thicker and harder volcanic deposits, was even more effectively sealed. Its preservation was exceptional, but that same preservation made it inaccessible. The hardened material above it resisted casual digging. Without reason to excavate deeply, people left it untouched. The names of these towns persisted in texts and administrative records, but their physical absence reduced their significance. A place without buildings, residents, or economic activity gradually loses its relevance. Pompeii and Herculaneum became references to past events rather than living locations. Roman writers occasionally mentioned the eruption, but often in passing. It served as an example of natural power or divine intervention, not as a subject of detailed historical analysis. The focus was rarely on the towns themselves. Instead, the event was folded into broader discussions about earthquakes, volcanoes, or the reign of Emperor Titus. This limited attention contributed to the gradual fading of detail. Without sustained interest, stories simplified. The complexity of what had happened, how different towns experienced different forms of destruction, how long suffering lasted in some places and how quickly it ended in others, was reduced to a single narrative of catastrophe. As the centuries passed and the Roman Empire itself changed, the context that had once given meaning to Pompeii and Herculaneum dissolved. Political structures shifted. Languages evolved. New settlements rose. Old records were lost, copied imperfectly, or reinterpreted. The eruption of 79 AD became a historical reference point, but the towns themselves receded into abstraction. During the late Roman period and into the early medieval era, the land around the Bay of Naples remained populated, but priorities changed. Security concerns, agricultural needs, and religious transformation reshaped settlement patterns. The buried cities did not fit neatly into these new frameworks. Christian communities in the region focused on churches, monasteries, and new centers of worship. Pagan temples buried under ash did not attract interest. The stories associated with them belonged to an earlier religious world that was increasingly distant. Natural processes continued to reshape the terrain. Erosion exposed some features while concealing others. In rare cases, construction projects encountered buried walls or artifacts. These discoveries were often treated pragmatically. Stone could be reused. objects could be repurposed. There was little incentive to investigate further. The idea of archaeology as a discipline did not exist. People did not dig to learn about the past for its own sake. They dug to build, farm, or extract materials. Without a conceptual framework that valued systematic exploration of ancient remains, buried cities remained buried. Pompeii and Herculaneum thus entered a long period of obscurity. They were not entirely forgotten in the sense of being erased from knowledge, but they were detached from the landscape. Their locations became uncertain. References to them lacked physical anchors. This detachment altered how people thought about the eruption itself. Without visible ruins, the disaster lost immediacy. It became one event among many in a long history of natural disturbances in Italy. Earthquakes, floods, and eruptions continued to occur elsewhere. The loss of two towns, while tragic, did not stand out as uniquely transformative. The human tendency to adapt to absence played a role as well. New generations grew up without direct experience of the buried towns. For them, Pompeii and Herculaneum were stories rather than places. Stories can be reshaped, abbreviated, or ignored more easily than physical realities. Land ownership changed hands repeatedly over the centuries. Estates expanded and contracted. Fields were divided and merged. The buried cities lay beneath these shifting boundaries, unnoticed and unclaimed as urban spaces. No one lived there. No one governed there. They existed outside the practical world. Even the mountain itself, which had been central to the disaster, resumed a quieter role. Though it erupted again in later centuries, its activity did not lead people to reconnect it with the buried towns in a sustained way. Each eruption was treated as a new event rather than as part of a continuing story. This fragmentation of memory is important. The fate of Pompeii and Herculaneum was not preserved as a continuous narrative passed down intact through generations. Instead, it was broken into pieces, a mention here, a reference there, a physical fragment reused without context. By the time Europe entered the later medieval period, the buried cities were effectively lost. Their names survived, but their substance did not. Maps did not mark them clearly. Travellers did not visit them. Scholars did not study them. Yet forgetting did not mean destruction. Beneath the surface, the towns remained remarkably intact. Ash and volcanic material created conditions that slowed decay. Organic materials were preserved in ways that would have been impossible above ground. Structures remained standing, sealed from weather and human interference. This unintended preservation set the stage for rediscovery. But that rediscovery would require a new way of thinking about the past, one that valued ancient remains not just as sources of material, but as sources of knowledge. That shift would not occur until much later, when curiosity, scholarship, and changing attitudes toward history combined to bring the buried cities back into human awareness. For centuries, however, Pompeii and Herculaneum existed in a kind of suspended state. They were neither alive nor entirely gone. They were present beneath the soil, absent from daily life, waiting for a moment when the world above would once again be interested in what lay below. The silence that followed their burial was long and deep. It was shaped not by deliberate erasure, but by the ordinary processes of forgetting, the movement of time, the demands of survival, and the constant reshaping of human priorities. Understanding this long period of obscurity helps explain why the rediscovery of these towns would later have such a powerful impact. They did not return gradually. They emerged into a world that had almost entirely forgotten them. And when they did, they would not be seen as ordinary ruins, but as windows into a vanished moment, preserved with a clarity that challenged assumptions about history, memory, and loss. Rediscovery under the ground. The return of Pompeii and Herculaneum to human awareness did not begin with curiosity or scholarship. It began, as many rediscoveries do, with accident. Centuries after the eruption, the buried cities remained silent beneath farmland, vineyards, and small settlements. their presence unknown to the people living above them. What brought them back into view was not a deliberate search for the past, but the practical demands of the present. In the early modern period, Campania was once again a densely inhabited region. Naples had grown into a major city, and the surrounding countryside was actively cultivated. Water management was a constant concern. Aqueducts, wells, and drainage channels were built and rebuilt to support agriculture and urban life. It was during one such engineering project in the early 18th century that Herculaneum was encountered for the first time. Workers digging a well struck something hard beneath the surface. At first, this was not unusual. The soil in Campania often contained stone and debris. But as digging continued, it became clear that this was not a natural rock formation. Walls appeared, then columns, then fragments of sculpture. The material was dense, dark, and difficult to remove, but unmistakably artificial. This discovery attracted attention, not because of historical interest, but because of value. Marble, bronze, and other materials could be reused or sold. Excavation began in a haphazard manner, driven by extraction rather than understanding. Tunnels were cut through the hardened volcanic material, following walls and corridors where they appeared. Objects were removed without record of their original positions. Context was not a priority. Herculaneum's burial under thick, compacted volcanic deposits made open excavation difficult. Instead, the town was explored through underground tunnels, creating a fragmented and distorted picture of what lay below. Rooms were entered from unexpected angles. Walls were breached. Floors were cut through. While this process damaged the site, it also revealed something extraordinary. Buildings preserved to an extent no one had imagined possible. Wooden beams, furniture, and even doors survived. Organic materials that would normally decay were intact, sealed away from air and moisture. Wall paintings retained vivid colours. Entire rooms appeared frozen in time. For those who saw these spaces, even without modern archaeological understanding, the impact was undeniable. Pompeii's rediscovery followed a different path. Its burial under lighter ash made it more accessible, though no one initially realised the scale of what lay beneath. In the mid-18th century, systematic digging began, again motivated largely by the search for valuable artefacts. As soil was removed, walls emerged, streets appeared, inscriptions were found, still legible after centuries underground. Unlike Herculaneum, Pompeii could be excavated from above. This allowed for broader exposure of streets and buildings, making it easier to recognise the town's layout. Gradually, it became clear that this was not a single villa or isolated structure, but an entire city. The realization changed everything. What had begun as treasure hunting turned into something larger. Scholars, artists, and officials recognized that Pompeii and Herculaneum offered unprecedented insight into ancient life. They were not ruins reduced to foundations and fragments. They were environments. The 18th century was a period of growing interest in classical antiquity. Art, architecture, and philosophy were deeply influenced by ancient Greek and Roman models. The rediscovery of entire Roman towns electrified this cultural climate. Visitors came not just to collect objects, but to see the past preserved in place. Still, early excavation practices were far from careful. Walls were stripped of paintings to be displayed elsewhere. Objects were removed without documentation. Entire sections were excavated quickly to satisfy curiosity and prestige rather than knowledge. Damage was done that could never be undone. Yet even imperfect excavation revealed astonishing detail. In Pompeii, graffiti covered walls recording jokes, insults, advertisements, and personal messages. These were not the voices of emperors or generals, but of ordinary people. Names, complaints, and endorsements appeared exactly where they had been written nearly 2,000 years earlier. Shops contained equipment and goods. Kitchens held utensils. Bedrooms showed arrangements of furniture. Streets revealed ruts from carts and stepping stones worn by countless feet. These details transformed understanding of Roman life, shifting focus away from elite texts and monuments toward everyday experience. Herculaneum offered different insights. Its preservation of organic material allowed scholars to study diet, furniture, and domestic architecture in unprecedented ways. Food remains revealed what people ate. Wooden structures showed construction techniques rarely preserved elsewhere. Even fabric fragments survived. As awareness of the importance of these sites grew, excavation practices slowly evolved. By the 19th century, archaeology began to emerge as a discipline with methods and standards. Careful recording, stratigraphic analysis, and contextual study became more common. The focus shifted from collecting objects to understanding relationships. This transition was uneven and incomplete, but it marked a crucial change. Pompeii and Herculaneum were no longer viewed solely as sources of valuable artifacts. They were recognized as complex historical records that could answer questions about society, economy, religion, and daily life. Public access increased. Excavated areas were open to visitors. Artists sketched scenes. Writers described their impressions. The buried cities entered popular imagination as symbols of sudden catastrophe and preserved time. Their story was retold in books, paintings, and later photographs. This growing attention also brought challenges. Exposure to air and weather began to damage structures that had been stable underground for centuries. Conservation became a new concern, one that required balancing access with preservation. Decisions about what to excavate, what to protect, and what to leave buried were increasingly complex. Political changes affected excavation as well. Control of the region shifted, funding fluctuated, priorities changed with governments and cultural trends. At times, excavation advanced rapidly. At others, it slowed or stopped. The work was never purely scientific. It was shaped by politics, economics, and public interest. Despite these complications, the rediscovery of Pompeii and Herculaneum fundamentally altered understanding of the ancient world. They provided a counterpoint to literary sources, grounding abstract history in physical reality. They showed how ordinary people lived, worked, decorated their homes, and interacted with one another. They also reshaped understanding of the eruption itself. Excavation revealed patterns of death and survival that written sources had not captured. Positions of bodies, distribution of ash, and damage to buildings allowed reconstruction of events with increasing precision. The disaster became not just a story, but a sequence of observable processes. Over time, scientific techniques expanded what could be learned. Analysis of volcanic deposits, refined timelines, study of skeletal remains, revealed health, diet, and cause of death. Examination of plant and animal remains illuminated the local environment. Each new method added depth to the picture. Yet the rediscovery also raised ethical questions. How should human remains be treated? How much excavation is appropriate? What responsibility do modern societies have to preserve these sites for future generations? These questions remain open and contested. Pompeii and Herculaneum today are neither fully excavated nor fully understood. Large portions remain buried, deliberately left untouched to protect them. What is visible represents only part of what lies beneath. The cities continue to yield information, but they also demand restraint. The act of rediscovery, then, is ongoing. It did not end with the first tunnels or trenches. It continues with every careful study, every conservation effort, and every decision to leave something buried rather than expose it. What began as accidental contact between shovel and stone became a sustained encounter between present and past. The buried cities did not return to life, but they returned to meaning. They became part of human knowledge again, not as functioning communities, but as preserved moments that challenge assumptions about time, memory, and loss. Their rediscovery reminds us that history is not always lost forever. Sometimes it waits, sealed beneath layers of chance and neglect, until circumstances bring it back into view. When it does, it can change how we see both the past and ourselves. When scholars, excavators and visitors began to spend sustained time among the exposed streets of Pompeii and Herculaneum, something subtle but profound happened. The ruins did not simply confirm what was already known about Roman life. Instead, they complicated it. They challenged assumptions formed from elite literature, imperial monuments, and idealized art. What emerged from these buried towns was not a polished portrait of antiquity, but a textured, uneven human world. One of the first lessons the ruins taught was how ordinary Roman life actually functioned at ground level. Literary sources had long emphasized senators, emperors, generals, and philosophers. Pompeii and Herculaneum shifted attention toward shopkeepers, artisans, slaves, freedmen, and families whose lives rarely entered written history. Their presence was everywhere, in the layout of houses, in the tools left behind, in the graffiti scratched into plaster. The cities revealed that Roman urban life was intensely mixed. Wealth and poverty existed side by side, sometimes within the same building. A lavishly decorated dining room could open onto a modest street-level shop. A grand house might share a wall with cramped apartments. This proximity contradicted earlier assumptions that Roman cities were neatly segregated by class. The organization of domestic space offered especially rich insight. Houses were not simply places of rest. They were sites of business, social negotiation, and display. The arrangement of rooms reflected social priorities. Public-facing areas near entrances were designed to impress visitors, while private spaces were tucked deeper inside. This spatial hierarchy shaped daily interactions and reinforced social status without explicit rules. Herculaneum, with its preserved upper floors and wooden elements, added layers of understanding unavailable elsewhere. Furniture placement showed how rooms were actually used, not just how they were decorated. Storage spaces revealed patterns of consumption and preparation. Even staircases and door hinges offered clues about movement and privacy. The ruins also transformed understanding of Roman economics. Shops contained equipment and remnants of goods that illustrated local production and trade. Bakers' ovens, fullers' workshops, metalworking spaces, and taverns demonstrated how urban economies functioned on a daily basis. These were not abstract systems described in theory. They were practical operations embedded in neighbourhoods. Food remains provided another window into daily life. Analysis of plant and animal remains showed that diet varied by status but was often more diverse than expected. People ate grains, fruits, vegetables, fish, and meat when available. Preservation at Herculaneum even revealed specific items such as bread loaves, fruit baskets, and containers of prepared foods. These details grounded Roman life in physical necessity rather than literary ideal. Health and medicine also became clearer through study of human remains. Skeletal analysis revealed signs of nutritional stress, disease, and injury. Life expectancy varied widely. Some individuals showed evidence of hard labour, while others appeared relatively well-nourished. Dental health, bone development, and trauma patterns painted a complex picture of physical life in Roman towns. The ruins challenged romanticised visions of Roman hygiene as well. While bathhouses were central to social life, water systems were imperfect. Lead pipes, shared facilities, and limited waste disposal created health risks alongside benefits. Public cleanliness existed, but it coexisted with smells, noise, and congestion that modern observers might find overwhelming. Religion, as revealed by the ruins, was woven into everyday life rather than confined to grand temples. Household shrines appeared in kitchens and corridors. Small offerings and images showed personal devotion alongside public ritual. This confirmed that Roman religion was not primarily about belief in the modern sense, but about practice and participation. Graffiti became one of the most surprising sources of insight. Walls preserved casual messages, political endorsements, romantic declarations, insults, jokes, price lists, and advertisements. These texts revealed voices rarely preserved elsewhere. They showed literacy was more widespread than previously assumed, at least at a functional level. They also showed humour, frustration, desire, and rivalry in raw form. The social role of entertainment emerged more clearly as well. Amphitheatres, theatres, and performance spaces were not peripheral. They were central to civic identity. The evidence of past riots, repairs, and bans illustrated how entertainment could both unify and destabilize communities. Spectacle was not escapism alone, it was deeply political. Slavery, often abstracted in historical discussion, became concrete in the ruins. Living quarters for enslaved people were small and utilitarian. Chains and restraints appeared in some contexts. Tools of labour were common, yet evidence also showed variation. Some enslaved individuals managed businesses or held skilled positions. The institution was pervasive, but not monolithic. Gender roles could be studied through space, objects, and inscriptions rather than moral texts. Women appeared as business owners, religious participants, and social actors. Domestic artifacts suggested involvement in economic management and social networking. The ruins complicated simplistic views of female passivity in Roman society. Children, largely invisible in literary sources, left subtle but important traces. Toys, small shoes, and skeletal remains showed that childhood was a recognized stage of life, marked by play, learning, and vulnerability. Mortality rates among children were high, shaping family structures and emotional life. Urban planning emerged as pragmatic rather than idealized. Streets followed functional routes rather than strict grids. Infrastructure adapted to terrain and existing structures. Repairs after earthquakes showed improvisation and resilience rather than strict adherence to original design. The city was not static, it evolved constantly. Perhaps, most significantly, the ruins taught historians how Romans experienced time. The layering of renovations, repairs, and redecorations revealed an ongoing present rather than a fixation on the past. People reused older walls, repainted over previous designs, and modified spaces as needs changed. History was not preserved intentionally, it was overwritten. The eruption itself became a source of methodological insight. By analysing deposits and body positions, researchers reconstructed the sequence of events with increasing precision. This showed how scientific methods could complement historical sources, creating a dialogue between text and material evidence. The plaster casts of victims created in the 19th century further humanized the disaster. Though later criticized for ethical reasons, they revealed posture, clothing, and sometimes facial expression. They transformed abstract numbers into individuals, making the cost of the eruption visible in deeply personal ways. At the same time, these casts raised questions about representation. They reflected the values and assumptions of the period that created them. Modern approaches increasingly emphasize skeletal analysis and respectful treatment rather than dramatic display. The ruins thus continue to teach not only about the past, but about how each era interprets it. Pompeii and Herculaneum also reshaped understanding of Roman resilience. The towns were not decadent cities waiting to fall. They were active, adaptable communities responding to challenges. Their destruction was not moral or symbolic, it was geological. This reframing removed judgment from disaster and replaced it with context. The lessons extended beyond Roman studies. Archaeologists working in other regions adopted methods refined at Pompeii and Herculaneum. The idea that entire communities could be studied holistically, architecture, objects, human remains, and environment together became central to archaeology as a discipline. Public engagement with the ruins influenced how history was taught and understood. Textbooks, museums, and documentaries drew on imagery from Pompeii to illustrate Roman life. The past became more tangible, less abstract. This accessibility had educational power, but it also risked oversimplification. The ruins resist simple narratives. They do not tell a single story of luxury, decay, or moral failure. They present a mosaic of lives shaped by opportunity, constraint, routine, and chance. They show people planning for tomorrow, unaware that tomorrow would not come. In this way, Pompeii and Herculaneum taught a lesson that extends beyond history. They revealed how ordinary life, in all its complexity, can be preserved by extraordinary circumstances. They showed that what survives is not always what was meant to last, but what happened to be in the right place at the wrong time. As research continues, new technologies reveal details once thought inaccessible. Chemical analysis, digital mapping, and non-invasive scanning allow study without excavation. These tools expand understanding while preserving what remains. The ruins continue to teach because they are not finished speaking. Each generation asks new questions and finds new answers. The cities remain incomplete archives, offering evidence but demanding interpretation. What they ultimately teach is humility. They remind us that even the most advanced societies can be undone by forces beyond their understanding, and that the traces left behind are partial, fragile, and shaped by chance. From the streets and rooms of Pompeii and Herculaneum, history learned to listen more carefully not just to the powerful, but to the ordinary, whose lives shaped the world as much as any empire, Vesuvius still watching. Long after Pompeii and Herculaneum disappeared beneath ash and hardened volcanic debris, the mountain that destroyed them remained. It did not retreat into myth or legend. It stayed exactly where it had always been, overlooking the Bay of Naples, shaping the land and the lives around it. What changed was not the mountain itself, but how people gradually learned to live with the knowledge of what it could do. In the centuries following the eruption of 79 AD, Mount Vesuvius did not remain quiet. It erupted again and again, sometimes violently, sometimes modestly, reminding each new generation that the land beneath their feet was active rather than fixed. Yet even repeated eruptions did not produce permanent abandonment. People continued to settle nearby, drawn by fertile soil, strategic location, and the enduring pull of the coast. This pattern reveals something essential about human behaviour. Knowledge of danger does not automatically lead to avoidance. Instead, it becomes one factor among many in decisions about where and how to live. Over time, risk is normalised. It becomes part of the background, weighed against opportunity rather than treated as absolute. The area around Vesuvius remained agriculturally productive. Volcanic soil, once cooled and weathered, supported vineyards, orchards, and farms. This productivity created economic incentives that were difficult to ignore. Communities rebuilt and expanded, sometimes directly atop earlier layers of destruction. Life resumed not because people forgot the past, but because they learned to live alongside it. As scientific understanding advanced in the modern era, Vesuvius became one of the most closely studied volcanoes in the world. Its eruptions were recorded, analysed, and compared. The mountain was no longer seen solely through the lens of divine will or chance, but as part of a geological system governed by physical processes. This shift did not eliminate fear, but it reframed it. Danger became something that could be monitored, measured, and to some extent anticipated. Instruments were placed on and around the mountain to detect seismic activity, gas emissions, and ground deformation. These tools transformed Vesuvius from a silent threat into a monitored presence. Yet monitoring does not equal control. Scientists can observe signs of unrest, but they cannot prevent eruption. The mountain operates on timescales and forces beyond human influence. Knowledge provides warning, not immunity. Modern Naples and the surrounding towns exist within this tension. Millions of people live within range of Vesuvius, aware of its history and potential. Evacuation plans exist. Emergency scenarios are modelled. Yet daily life continues much as it does anywhere else. Schools open, markets operate, homes are built and maintained. This coexistence reflects a broader human pattern. societies adapt to persistent risk by integrating it into normality. Earthquake zones, floodplains, and volcanic regions around the world are inhabited not because people underestimate danger, but because life continues in spite of it. The story of Pompeii and Herculaneum has become a reference point in this ongoing relationship between humans and natural forces. It serves as a reminder, studied in classrooms and museums, cited in discussions of disaster preparedness and urban planning. Yet its lesson is not simple. It does not tell us that people should flee all dangerous landscapes, nor does it suggest that catastrophe is inevitable wherever nature is active. Instead, it shows how risk, perception, and experience interact. The residents of Pompeii did not ignore warnings. They lacked a framework to interpret what they were seeing. Modern societies have frameworks, but they still face uncertainty. Vesuvius today is often described as one of the most dangerous volcanoes in the world, not because it erupts frequently, but because of the number of people living nearby. This danger is statistical, not moral. It arises from density, infrastructure, and timing rather than from human error alone. The mountain's presence continues to shape culture and identity in the region. It appears in art, literature, and everyday language. It is both a symbol of beauty and a reminder of vulnerability. People photograph it, hike its slopes, and farm its land, all while knowing its history. This duality is not contradictory. Humans are capable of holding appreciation and fear simultaneously. The same mountain that threatens destruction also offers fertility and meaning. The same land that buried cities also preserves them. From a historical perspective, Vesuvius teaches patience. Its cycles do not align with human lifespans or political eras. Eruptions occur decades or centuries apart. Memory fades between them. Each generation inherits both the benefits and the risks, often without direct experience of disaster. This fading of memory is natural. Pompeii itself was forgotten for centuries despite the magnitude of its destruction. Knowledge must be actively maintained to remain effective. Without education, monitoring, and preparation, societies drift back toward complacency. At the same time, constant alarm is unsustainable. People cannot live indefinitely in a state of emergency. Balance is required. Awareness without paralysis, preparation without obsession. This balance is difficult to achieve and constantly renegotiated. The ruins of Pompeii and Herculaneum stand as physical anchors for this negotiation. They are reminders that the past was once present, that ordinary life can be interrupted without warning, and that the traces left behind may outlast the people who made them. They also remind us that history is not only about grand events or famous individuals. It is about daily routines, small decisions, and assumptions that seem reasonable until circumstances change. The people who lived beneath Vesuvius were not careless or ignorant. They were human, acting within the limits of their knowledge. The mountain still watches over the region, unchanged in its essential nature. It does not intend harm or offer protection. It simply exists, following physical laws indifferent to human plans. This indifference is not hostile, it is neutral. Understanding this neutrality is perhaps the most important lesson. Disasters are not punishments or messages. They are interactions between human settlement and natural process. Responsibility lies not in blaming the past, but in learning how to respond in the present. As technology advances, the relationship between people and Vesuvius continues to evolve. New monitoring systems improve warning times. Urban planning incorporates hazard zones. Education spreads awareness. These measures reduce risk, but they do not erase it. The story of Pompeii and Herculaneum remains relevant because it does not offer closure. It does not end with resolution or redemption. It ends with continuation. A mountain still active, a region still inhabited, a past still studied. This continuity links ancient experience with modern life. It reminds us that history is not separate from the present. The same forces that shaped ancient Campania operate today. The difference lies in how we choose to respond. Vesuvius stands as a quiet presence now, its slopes green, its outline familiar. It does not announce when it will act again. It does not need to. Its history is written into the land and into human memory. The cities it buried are no longer living places, but they are not gone. They exist as preserved moments, teaching patience, humility, and attentiveness. They ask us to look closely at ordinary life, because it is ordinary life that history most often interrupts. In the end, Mount Vesuvius is not a villain or a symbol. It is a reminder. It reminds us that the world we inhabit is active, that permanence is provisional, and that understanding comes slowly, often after loss. The mountain still watches, and so do we. As we come to the quiet end of tonight's journey, let the story settle softly around you. The noise of eruption, the movement of people, and the long passage of centuries can now fade into stillness. Imagine the landscape as it is today, calm, solid, and quiet in the evening air. The past rests beneath the ground, not demanding attention, only offering perspective. Lives once lived, routines once followed, now preserved as reminders rather than warnings. There is no urgency here now, only the slow rhythm of time continuing forward. Let your breathing slow. Let the weight of the day ease away. History, for all its power, does not rush you. It waits patiently, just as those buried cities waited to be remembered. You are safe. The night is steady,